안녕하십니까. 건설산업비전포럼의 사무총장 권호경입니다. 건설산업비전포럼은 제219차 정기 모임으로 영국의 원자력 발전 현황과 한국과 영국의 협력방안이라는 주제의 국제세미나를 개최하게 되었습니다. 본 세미나는 주한영국대사관이 주최하고 건설산업비전포럼과 한국엔지니어링협회가 주관하고 있습니다. 오늘 진행 순서를 간략히 말씀드리겠습니다. 토론회는 5시 30분까지 3시간 30분 동안 진행될 예정입니다. 사전 행사 이후에 기념 사진을 촬영하고 바로 주제 발표에 들어가도록 하겠습니다. 토론회에는 플로어의 참여가 매우 중요합니다. 플로어에서 질의하실 분은 사전에 나눠드린 질의서를 작성해서 저희 스타프에게 주시면은 좌장님을 통해서 질의를 하도록 하겠습니다. 자, 그럼 지금부터 건설산업비전포럼 제219차 국제세미나를 시작하겠습니다. 순서에 의거 건설산업비전포럼 공동대표이신 이현수 서울대 교수님의 개회사가 있겠습니다. 많은 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
안녕하세요. 오늘 참 날씨가 참 좋습니다. 완연한 그 늦가을의 날씨인 것 같습니다. 건설산업비전포럼은 제219차 정기 모임인 국제세미나 주제로 영국의 원자력 발전 현황과 한영 협력방안을 선정하였습니다. 우선 세미나에 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 감사의 인사를 드립니다. 특히 이번 세미나를 개최해 주신 주한영국대사관의 콜린 크룩스 대사님께 감사의 말씀드립니다. 또한 국제세미나의 성공적인 개최를 위해 함께 노력해 주신 한국엔지니어링협회 이혜경 회장님과 후원을 해 주신 한국전력공사와 두산에너빌리티에도 감사의 마음을 전합니다. 대한민국은 1978년 4월 최초의 상업 원자력발전소인 고리 원자력발전소 제1호기가 발전을 시작하였습니다. 2022년 현재 24기가 운영되고 있고 4기가 건설 중인 원자력발전소는 국내 전체 전력의 약 30%를 공급하고 있는 중요한 발전원입니다. 국제원자력기구 IAEA가 최근 발표한 2020년 기준 세계 원자력 발전량별 국가 순위에서 대한민국은 세계 5위를 차지하고 있습니다. 하지만 우리나라의 원전 기술력은 그 이상이라고 자부합니다. 오늘 세미나에도 참석하셨지만 한국전력, 한국수력원자력, 두산에너빌리티, 현대건설 등이 보유하고 있는 원전 기술은 세계 최고의 수준의 안전성을 인정받고 있습니다. 유럽 공동체는 올해 7월 6일 원자력을 그린 텍서노미에 포함시켰고 미국 에너지부는 2월 11일에 60억 달러, 우리 돈으로 7조 2천억 원의 규모의 원자력 발전소 운영 지원 계획을 발표하였습니다. 올해 출범한 우리나라의 새 정부는 신한울 3, 4호기 건설을 재개하고 2030년까지 원전 비중을 30% 이상으로 높이겠다는 약속을 하였고 국내 기업들도 전 세계의 원전 건설 수주에 뛰어들면서 원전의 중요성은 새롭게 부각되고 있습니다. 영국은 현재 초기 사업비 28조 5천억 원의 힌클리 포인트 원전을 건설하고 있으며 롤스로이스 컨소시엄의 주도하에 소형 모듈러 원자료인 SMR 건설도 추진하고 있습니다. 또한 영국의 많은 원전 전문 기업들이 한국 시장에서 활동하고 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 건설산업 오피니언 리더들의 모임인 우리 포럼은 원전 수주가 해외 건설 시장의 확대에 크게 기여할 것으로 기대하고 있습니다. 그동안 우리나라의 해외 건설 산업은 중동을 비롯한 아시아 지역에 집중되었고 선진국 시장 진출에는 한계가 있었습니다. 하지만 유럽과 아시아 대륙을 연결하는 터키의 차나켈라 대교를 지난 4월에 준공하였고 SK 에코플랜트는 영국의 실버타운 터널 프로젝트를 수행하고 있습니다. 따라서 우리나라 건설기업은 이제 유럽 시장을 넘어서서 미국 시장 진출을 모색하면서 해외 건설 영토를 개척해 나가기 위해서 노력하고 있습니다. 이러한 노력에 영국은 우리나라의 중요한 파트너가 될 것이라고 믿습니다. 본 세미나에서는 영국 원자력협회 톰 그렉스 회장님께서 영국의 원전 현황과 협력 방안을 발표하시고 힌클리 포인트 C와 셀러필드의 프로그램 매니지먼트를 담당하고 있는 영국 터너 앤 타우슨즈의 마크스 세베이지 단장님께서 프로젝트 사례를 발표해 주실 것입니다. 이번 세미나는 영국 원자력 산업을 이해하고 프로젝트 레벨의 조직, 기술, 관리 및 프로젝트 파이낸싱에 대한 지식과 정보를 습득하는 좋은 기회가 될 것입니다. 또한 관산 학연의 전문가들이 패널로 참여하여 미래 원전 기술의 방향과 한국과 영국의 원전 시장 상호 진출 방안, 제3국의 동반 진출 방안 등에 대한 심도 있는 토론이 이루어지길 기대합니다. 아무쪼록 오늘 세미나가 일회성이 아니라 한국과 영국에서 지속적으로 개최되어 두 나라의 원전 협력을 위한 기폭제가 되기를 바랍니다. 이번 국제 세미나에 토론회에 참석하기 위해서 한국을 방문해 주신 두 분의 발표자와 또한 토론 제장을 맡아주실 서균열 교수님을 비롯한 패널 분들께 깊이 감사드립니다. 그리고 건설 산업과 원전 사업에 각별한 관심을 가지고 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 감사의 말씀을 전합니다. 감사합니다.
네, 이현수 대표님 감사합니다. 다음은 주한영국대사관의 콜린 크룩스 대사님의 축사가 있겠습니다. 많은 박수를 부탁드리겠습니다.
예, 안녕하십니까 여러분. 주한영국대사 콜린 크룩스입니다. 이렇게 2022 한영 원자력 발전 협력 방안 세미나에 축사를 맡게 되어 매우 기쁩니다. 먼저 오늘 행사 준비를 위해 써주신 건설산업비전포럼의 이현수 대표님께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 또한 오늘 저와 함께 축사를 맡으신 산업통상자원부 박일준 제2차관님께 특별히 환영 인사를 드립니다. 영국은 원자력이 기후 변화와 에너지 안보 모두에서 중요한 역할을 할 것이라고 확신합니다. 이와 같은 확신은 바탕으로 영국은 2050년까지 24기가와트의 새로운 민간 원전을 건설할 계획을 가지고 있습니다. 또한 현재 영국 전력 수요의 7%를 제공할 힌클리 포인트 C를 건설 중에 있으며 현 의회 임기 내에 추가적인 대형 원자력 건설 프로젝트에 대한 최종 투자 결정을 승인하겠다는 방침을 세우고 있습니다. 야심찬 24기가와트 목표 달성을 위해 영국은 기가 프로젝트 및 SMR 기술력을 보유한 파트너에게 모든 협력 기회를 개방할 계획입니다. 오늘 NIA와 터너 앤 타운센드에서 오신 두 분의 영국 연사님들을 이 자리에 모셨습니다. 이분들은 영국의 원자력 산업 현황 및 현재 영국의 건설 중에 있는 힌클리 프로젝트에 대한 상세한 내용을 발표해 주실 예정입니다. 한영 양국은 현재 전체적인 관계 발전 및 유지에 있어 매우 중요한 순간을 마주하고 있습니다. 세계 번영, 평화, 기후변화, 에너지 및 공급망 보안과 같은 글로벌 문제에 대해 대응하기 위해 양국 관계 강화하는 그 어느 때보다 중요해졌습니다. 올해 초 영국 총리는 윤 대통령과 한영 양자 프레임워크에 서명했습니다. 이는 에너지와 원자력을 포함한 정치, 경제, 과학, 사회 및 문화 분야에서 더욱 긴밀한 협력을 유지하는 것에 합의한 것입니다. 한영 FTA 재협상 또한 곧 진행될 예정이며 영국은 다음 주 모든 이행 관계자의 의견을 수립하기 위한 Call for Input을 시행할 예정입니다. 한층 더 강화된 FTA는 양국에 상당한 경제적 이익을 제공하고 상호 무역 및 투자 규모를 증대시킬 것입니다. 2021년 상품 및 서비스 분야의 한영 무역 규모는 2020년에서 21억 파운드 증가한 146억 파운드에 도달했습니다. 새로운 FTA를 통해 디지털 무역, 녹색 성장, 투자 및 서비스 분야에 있어 더 많은 한영 경제 협력의 기회가 제공될 것이라고 생각합니다. 이와 같은 선상에서 한층 더 강화된 원자력 분야 협력을 통해 한영 양국의 기후변화, 에너지 안보 그리고 국가 번영에도 기여할 수 있기를 희망합니다. 영국은 영국 내 기업들에게 해외 파트너 기업들의 프로젝트에 협력할 것을 장려하고 있습니다. 또한 이와 동시에 해외 기업들에게 영국 공급망 참여, 원자력 기술 발전에 투자, 그리고 차세대 아이디어와 기술 공동 연구 개발 및 상용화 등을 통해 영국 시장에 참여할 것을 장려합니다. 오늘 이 행사는 양국의 원자력 산업 협력 관계를 한층 더 발전시킬 수 있는 좋은 기회라고 생각합니다. 양국 모두의 발전에 도움이 될 수 있는 혁신적이고 협조적인 파트너십을 구축해 나가기를 희망하겠습니다. 여러분 모두의 성공적인 미래를 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
예, 대사님 감사합니다. 대사님이 한국말을 너무 잘하셔서 어느 분의 축사보다도 이해가 잘 되셨으리라고 믿습니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 다음은 정말 바쁘신 가운데 시간을 내주셨습니다. 산업통상자원부 박일준 차관님의 축사가 있겠습니다. 많은 박수 부탁드립니다.
예, 산업통상자원부 차관입니다. 박일준입니다. 먼저 오늘 이렇게 영국의 원자력 발전 관련해서 한영 협력방안에 관련된 세미나 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 오늘 이렇게 뜻깊은 세미나를 주최해 주신 콜린 크룩스 주한영국대사님, 또 이현수 건설산업비전포럼 대표님, 이혜경 한국엔지니어링협회 회장님께 또 참석하신 모든 분들께 감사 인사를 드립니다. 한국과 영국이 매우 긴밀한 우방이라는 점은 제가 더 말씀드릴 필요가 없을 것 같습니다. 또 경제 규모나 또 발전 가능성 이런 걸 볼 때 양국 간의 경제 관계가 훨씬 더 확대될 잠재력이 있다고 생각합니다. 또 에너지 원전 부분은 특히 그 중요한 전략 분야의 하나라고 할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 다들 아시다시피 전 세계적으로 에너지 안보, 탄소 중립 이 두 가지의 큰 에너지 분야의 이슈가 있습니다. 영국도 에너지 안보 전략을 수립을 해서 원전 비중을 늘려나갈 예정이다 하는 부분은 조금 전에 대사님께서 말씀을 잘 해주셨고요. 한국 정부 역시 새 정부 에너지 정책 방향을 통해서 원전의 비중을 좀 더 확대해 나가겠다 하는 계획을 발표를 했습니다. 이렇게 양국 모두가 원전의 역할을 강화하고 또 재생에너지도 합리적으로 늘려나가겠다 이렇게 한 정책을 발표한 시점에서 오늘 원전을 주제로 포럼이 개최된 것이 매우 시의적절하다고 생각합니다. 지금까지 이 한국이 원전의 종주국을 어떻게 보면 영국이라고 할 수 있는데 고리 원전에도 영국이 터빈 발전기를 공급하는 등 기여를 많이 했고 또 그런 기여를 바탕으로 한국의 원전이 성공적으로 지금 성장해 왔습니다. 앞으로도 조금 전에 대사님께서 말씀하셨듯이 영국의 신규 원전 건설 사업에 우리 우수한 한국 기업들이 참여할 수 있을 거라고 생각합니다. 또 제3국 진출에도 같이 할 수 있다고 생각합니다. 원전에 대한 영국의 경험과 한국의 어떤 건설 운영 능력이 합해진다면 경쟁력 있는 한 팀이 될 수 있을 거라고 생각합니다. 또 미래에도 SMR 같은 분야에 있어서 협력이 가능하다고 봅니다. SMR을 보다 더 보급 확산시켜 나가고 또 새로운 인허가 체계를 마련하는데 다자간의 협의체에서 양국이 협력할 수 있다고 생각합니다. 한국에도 한국 속담에 백지장도 맞들면 낫다라는 속담이 있듯이 영국에도 비슷한 속담이 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 이런 양국의 비슷한 속담이 있는 것과 같이 두 나라 전문가들이 지혜를 모아서 서로 양국 산업의 발전에 또 서로 윈윈할 수 있는 좋은 계기가 만들어지기를 바람하지 않습니다. 다시 한번 오늘 행사를 축하드리고 참석하신 모든 분들 건강과 행운이 함께 하시길 빌겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 차관님 감사합니다. 이것으로 사전 행사를 마치겠습니다. 영국 원자력산업협회 회장이신 탐 그레이트렉스께서 해 주시겠습니다. 그레이트렉스 회장님은 2016년부터 영국 원자력산업협회 회장직을 맡고 계십니다. 국회의원을 역임하셨고요. 전력 생산 및 송전, 에너지 보완, 탈산소화에 관한 영국 의회 노동당의 수석 대변인으로 4년 동안 지내셨고 섀도우 에너지 미니스터를 역임하셨습니다. 회장님의 발표를 부탁드립니다. 회장님, 발표를 부탁드립니다. 많은 박수 부탁드립니다.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be part of the seminar and discussion today. And as I think we heard from the Minister and from the Ambassador, it's a very timely discussion to have at the moment. There is a lot of interest in both the UK and in Korea and in other parts of the world in nuclear power as an important part or an important component of our future energy mix in a scenario where we both need to decarbonise and ensure that we have energy security. And I'm going to this afternoon give you the context and the background to where the policy in the UK is, why it is where it is, how the similarities there are between the UK and other parts of the world in relation to some of that. I will just briefly touch on current and anticipated future projects in the UK. My colleague Mark will talk in much more detail, both in relation to Hinkley Point C, but also in relation to decommissioning and activity at Sellafield, which is our most significant site for decommissioning activity. So we've both got quite a bit to get through, which I hope will be of interest and will help in terms of giving you some useful context for the panel discussion to come later. I think the first point I would make, just to explain who the Nuclear Industry Association are, we are a trade association for companies involved in the civil nuclear sector in the United Kingdom. So we are an organisation of companies, our members are companies, and we have 260 plus member companies working across the civil nuclear in existing generation, our existing fleet, and I'll come on to talk about our existing fleet in a few moments, in our former fleet and decommissioning activity, but also in those who are currently involved or are looking to be involved in new build activity in the United Kingdom, be that in gigawatt scale or SMR. So across the whole of that portfolio, and we've seen in the past year to 18 months a significant shift in the extent to which nuclear power has become part of the mainstream conversation in relation to both energy security and decarbonised power supplies. That's something which, whilst it was always there and has been the broad policy of successive UK governments, I think has had much more public attention and much more prominent in political debate in the recent past. And the reasons for that are pretty clear. In a European context, the impact of the significant rise in the cost of gas, which is where we get most of our electricity from in the UK still through burning fossil fuels. That has been compounded by the events in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a combination of events that have happened over the past period which have created, I hesitate to use the phraseology perfect storm, but a whole range of factors which have come into effect at a similar time, be that higher gas prices, lower yields than anticipated from wind power, for example, issues with interconnectors between different countries in Europe, issues with power fleet in other countries, including France, all of which I think have underlined to governments across Europe the importance of energy security and a realization that in reality, as opposed to in academic theory, you cannot offshore energy security. And that's something which some of us have been saying for a long period of time and have always known, and it stands up to scrutiny in terms of any objective analysis of the situation, but hasn't properly been appreciated or fully been appreciated, I don't think, by government and others to quite the extent that it should have been. So just to give you a background on where we are in the UK in terms of our energy mix and also our electricity mix. And these figures are not contradictory on this slide. On the left-hand side, it's energy as a whole. So for everything, for heating, power, fueling, transport, industry, everything else. In the UK, 85% of that comes currently from fossil fuels and primarily gas. That's including heating, and nearly all of our heating in the UK comes from gas. So of overall energy demand, electricity is 17%. And of that 17%, the pie chart on the bottom shows you in the last year that we have full figures available for, which is calendar year 2020, which are published in 2021. We will shortly get the figures for the following year. You can see the makeup of where that electricity part comes from. And you can see from that we have a very long way to go to get to a decarbonised power supply, let alone the commitments we have in terms of net zero and commitments that have been agreed at various COPs, including the COP that was in Glasgow last year and built upon in some of the things you've seen coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh this year to significantly reduce our demand on fossil fuels that contribute to carbon emissions. So at the moment, in the UK, over the course of a year, just under half of our electricity comes from low carbon sources. That's a mixture of wind, solar, hydro and nuclear. And of those, at the moment, nuclear has been the biggest single component. However, if you combine onshore and offshore wind, which are basically the same technology but in different settings, that will be above nuclear. And that nuclear percentage figure will decline in the period ahead, and I'll come on to speak about that in a couple of moments. But overall, to get to net zero, we need a lot more electricity capacity, because electricity will be a much greater proportion of our overall energy use if we're going to meet those decarbonisation targets and also improve energy security. So what do we need to do? It means we need to have, as far as it's possible, to have domestically produced electricity, and a lot of it. and that domestically produced electricity with the lowest possible carbon footprint. That's why nuclear becomes so significant when we're talking about the future as opposed to just the present. And when the UK government asked an independent body called the Committee on Climate Change to assess how the UK could get to net zero, when it could get to net zero, the earliest realistic date is 2050. And of the amount of electricity we're going to need, which is twice as much overall electricity capacity as electricity displaces other energy sources, that 38% of that electricity needs to be firm power. And firm power is closely associated with what we used to call baseload. It's not quite the same thing, but basically it means electricity that is dispatchable, that's reliable, that's dependable, that's not significantly weather dependent. And that is where nuclear is so significant, and it's why on any assessment that's been done, both in the UK context and globally, nuclear is an integral part of getting to that solution. And there are obviously different degrees of enthusiasm for nuclear in different places. There are different histories in different places. It's not to say that every country will have nuclear, but those that have had, both Korea, South Korea, and also the UK and others, will continue to and will probably need to have quite significantly more than we've had in the most recent past. So to the current, this is where the UK's current nuclear fleet of generating power stations is. Well, technically some of it was now, because as we've known for a very long time, over the course of this decade, the 2020s, in the UK, all but one of our power stations will reach the end of their generating lives. These are all, with the exception being Sizewell B, and I'll speak about that in a second, but with the exception of Sizewell B, they're all advanced gas reactors. They're all built in the sort of 1970s, 1980s. They're all coming towards it. They've all had extensions to their lifetimes. None of them will be possible to significantly extend those lives. So unlike in some other places, in Canada, for example, and other countries where there's been significant program of capital investment to extend the life of existing power stations, because of the technology that we have used in the UK, that isn't going to be possible, other than possibly maybe for Hartlepool and Heysham, we may be able to extend for maybe, coming towards a year or maybe slightly longer, but mostly it won't be able to be extended. So that is a pretty stark picture to demonstrate why, even if we wanted to continue to meet or to replace our current capacity, we've got a lot to be able to do. The reality is, though, as I've just referred to get to net zero, we're going to need more electricity capacity, and therefore 25% of power demand, which has historically been where nuclear has mostly been in the UK. It's been between 20 and 25% before it started to decline as reactors went offline. To get to that sort of figure, 25% of future electricity demand is going to be more than 25% of current electricity demand, fairly self-evidently. So in gigawatt terms, it means a lot more than we currently have, which is, we had until these started to retiring, which was between 8 and 9 gigawatts, and we'll probably need about 2 to 3 times that amount to even stand still in terms of likely percentage mix. The exception is Sizewell B. Sizewell B was started operating in the early 1990s. That's a pressurized water reactor, and has been since it started operating in the 1990s, one of the most reliable and dependable power generation sources, low carbon power generation sources anywhere in the world, significant to the United Kingdom. That power station is likely to be able to be extended probably to the 2050s. So overall generating lifetime will probably extend from the 40 years anticipated at time of operations beginning to probably 60 plus years. But that's just 1 gigawatt or 1.2 gigawatts. Everything else on that slide, unfortunately, will not be generating electricity. It will still be There'll still be people there. There'll be decommissioning activity, and we'll come on to that later. But in terms of contribution to electricity generation, we are, as we've known for a long period of time, really getting very close now to losing capacity quicker than decisions have been made to replace it. I've touched on this already, but just to make the point absolutely clear, energy security has become the biggest factor in the political and policy discussion around energy in the UK over the past period. As I said, a lot of that is due to the high prices of globally traded commodity of gas that's had a significant impact in terms of consumer bills. So people's bills in the UK have significantly increased, both in terms of their heating, which is predominantly gas, but also in terms of their electricity bills, because gas is the biggest part and also helps to set the market price for electricity. And whilst the UK government is currently in the process of putting in place a windfall tax on electricity generators, that doesn't do anything to actually offset the impact of significantly higher bills. And that's one factor. But that has a bigger economic impact as well, because we are, as with many countries in Europe, currently having got very high inflation, or high inflation historically when you look at the last 20 to 30 years, so inflation of above 10%, which is the first time that's happened since the way in which modern records have been kept. But, you know, probably a good 40 to 50 years since we had something similar, higher interest rates. You know, a lot of that is driven by the impact of the cost of energy going up significantly, and albeit not necessarily unexpectedly, certainly suddenly. And that obviously increases the cost of lots of things, whether they're manufactured or produced. Shortages of commodities all impact on the underlying economic conditions, and that's why energy is so significant and important. I think I've always thought, in terms of any areas of public policy, pretty much everything is impacted by energy, and it's why, in some ways, current events have helped to focus minds in the UK government and in other governments that this is not something you can just leave and hope will be okay. The day-ahead prices of electricity, therefore, in the UK have rocketed. You can see that in that graph at the bottom, just to show you that the cost increases over the course of the last almost 2 years. The red line on that graph is the cost, or is the level of the Hinkley Point C strike price, the contract for difference at £92.50 megawatt hour, which was often stated in the press, hideously expensive, twice the cost of market price electricity, which it was at the point at which the strike price was agreed. Electricity prices were about in the region of £40 to £50 a megawatt hour. These are 2012 figures. They'll obviously be higher in real terms now because of inflation. But the point of a contract for difference is that it sets both a floor and a ceiling. And in periods where electricity prices go significantly above that, there's a payback. And actually, that looks a pretty reasonable price for what will be a very long-lived asset that will last 70 to 80 years, probably, in terms of generating life, producing a lot of electricity from a small geographical footprint for a very, very long period of time. But the more low-carbon electricity we have, the lower the sensitivity to gas prices. If less of our electricity is coming from gas, less of our energy use is from gas, then it matters less in terms of its wider economic impact when gas prices rocket, as they have done in the very recent period. But the other factor, as if you have more low-carbon generation, is that what we call balancing costs increase as variable output forms of electricity make up a greater part of the system. So it makes managing the system more difficult. So for the grid operator in the UK, ensuring effectively that there is a supply at the times it's needed becomes more challenging. We have periods of time where there is significantly more electricity than can be used, periods of time when there is significantly less than is demanded, and that's when we have a range of different measures that are put into place that add to the costs. So balancing the grid, be that through either constraining capacity when there's a lot of wind, for example, or putting in place or activating implementations to deal with shortages, be that emergency generation capacity that comes on only at very peak periods of time, or constraining industrial activity, which comes with a price premium. All of those things add to that balancing cost. Now, that balancing cost is reduced the more firm power you have. So the more power you have, which is low carbon and dependable and dispatchable, the less significant those balancing costs have. Now, I'm talking about £2.5 billion just on balancing costs in the calendar year 2021, in a situation where overall, over the course of the year, from wind, that's probably overall about 30-odd% of our power. So 30 maybe up, getting towards 35, nudging high 30s. In a situation where that figure could be 65%, you can see the impact that has in terms of balancing the grid, both in terms of costs, which are passed on to consumers, but also in terms of just the difficulty of being able to do it and the number of mechanisms that are in place. So what that tells you is there's a reason why, in a scenario where energy security is much more significant than it was, where reliability of supply has become much more in focus, where there is a continuing commitment to decarbonisation, firm low-carbon power, i.e. from nuclear, which is the only viable way of doing that, is therefore very significantly high up in the policy agenda in the UK and other places. I'll just touch on this relatively briefly, because I don't think it's anything that anyone here isn't familiar with, but just to make the point in terms of carbon footprint of different ways of generating electricity. That slide with the numbers will show you the carbon intensity. This is grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour of power produced. It's lifetime emissions. Source is the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which took as its sources all of the existing generation in Europe. And what that demonstrates, beyond, I think, any serious doubt, is that not only is nuclear low carbon and therefore relevant for a 2050 scenario, net zero scenario, it's actually, in lifetime emissions terms, lower carbon than anything else. And people sometimes say, well, look, there's a lot of steel and concrete in and energy-intensive processes in nuclear, so how can that be the case? There's mining at the start, there's decommissioning at the end. All of those things have to be factored in. Well, yes, they are in this study. But also, the energy density of nuclear means that those impacts are relatively less significant than, for example, high concrete and steel content of floating offshore wind turbines, to give an example. And in terms of extraction and mining activities, as carbon intensity is taken account of in this study and material, actually the lowest mining material use. All that comes back to the same point, really, which is the physics of nuclear, which is you get a lot of energy from a relatively small and contained process. It's just a law of physics that gives you a lot of power. And that's why nuclear, again, is something which is absolutely low carbon and therefore relevant and proportionate to the response we're talking about. Just to make the point about the different, the variability we have in our system in the UK, because we have more, mostly wind, but also some solar, but renewable capacity in our system. On a good day, in terms of carbon intensity, which is the top map, you can see we have had days where we've got to, where it's been pretty windy, where it's not been too cold, sometimes on days when it's sunny, and you've got your sort of chunk of nuclear, which is pretty consistent in both those pictures. You can see we do get to about 3/4 of our power coming from low carbon sources, and therefore a carbon intensity which is significantly lower and within our 2030 target. But by the same token, you also get days like the one at the bottom, which is when it isn't very windy, when it's cold, when it's dark, where demand for heating and power is highest. And quite often in the UK and across Europe, we have a couple of weeks in the winter at least where this is what we're likely to expect. A high-pressure weather system sits over Western Europe. Demand is at its peak, and in that scenario, you can see there is almost very relatively little wind and solar, a lot of gas. The nuclear bit stays the same in both. It stands to reason. If that nuclear bit was bigger in both, that would mean that it wouldn't affect the carbon intensity in the top one, but it would positively impact the carbon intensity in the bottom one. So the firm power that nuclear provides is also a way of counteracting that grid variability, which is a feature, and will continue to be a feature, I think, of future energy systems, electricity grids, not just in the UK, but elsewhere as well. But everything I've said so far about nuclear, I've been talking about grid electricity. Important to make the point that grid electricity is only one part of decarbonisation and energy security. When we think about the ways in which we use energy for other things, including transportation, heating, industrial processes, all of that has to be decarbonised. You can do that significantly by using electricity. Some things you can't easily electrify, or certainly not yet. So there's a lot of discussion about how then can you decarbonise that activity? How can you make sure that your wider decarbonisation and net zero targets can be met and your energy security can be improved? And hydrogen is obviously, fairly obviously, one of the ways in which you can do that. Hydrogen for heating, hydrogen for industrial processes, hydrogen potentially for synthetic fuels for aviation, and also for maritime transport and trading, for example. And we have a debate in the UK which is pretty unhelpful in terms of the way it's labelled, where you've got different colours for different types of hydrogen production. But fundamentally, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss this a bit more later, but fundamentally, if the reason for introducing hydrogen as a way of consuming energy is about energy security and decarbonisation, then it makes little sense to do it any other way than using low carbon electricity. And low carbon electricity is the input through electrolysis that produces that hydrogen, and that can be as effective coming from excess wind power at times when it's very windy, counteracting some of the factors I described earlier in terms of constrained costs. But it's also true that nuclear could also produce green hydrogen through electrolysis, at least as, if not more efficiently, than doing it from excess offshore wind. And sometimes the debate about hydrogen misses the point that hydrogen, whilst it's an energy vector, isn't a way of producing power. And sometimes in some scenarios you see hydrogen introduced almost as though it's a displacement for other things. The reality is, what is likely to be the case is that either you will need that electricity capacity significantly increased to use electricity to meet these energy needs, and it's probably or you need the electricity to ensure that you can produce the hydrogen to then use in these other activities that require significant energy. So that is a very live debate at the moment in the UK and more widely, and we've seen the European discussions around hydrogen economy and in the US and elsewhere, that whilst there is almost a sense that some people sort of see hydrogen as being the ideal solution to being able to deal with those harder to decarbonise areas of activity, now discussion is seriously turning to how do you produce the hydrogen that you're going to need to be able to do that. And it comes back to, either way, it comes back to and points to the same thing, which is a lot more electricity. I'm just going to touch on a couple of other factors briefly just before I finish, which are, I think, significant just in terms of UK context. We sometimes hear about public perceptions of nuclear. This is just to show you polling that the NIA has done amongst the British public over the course of, I think it's 16, 17 years now, which shows you the question that is put to people is, do you agree that we need a mix of energy sources for our future supply, including new nuclear alongside renewables? And that has never, I think, been below 2/3 of the public either strongly approve or tend to approve of that statement. It's been around about an average 70% pretty much consistently. It's gone up, particularly in the last year. We last did this in April. That's because I think there's much more awareness amongst the public of energy security issues and the way in which you are able to respond to that. So by the same token, those who oppose or tend to oppose that statement has remained in the low teens and has dipped below 10% in the last time that we have asked. That's what the net agree and net disagree. And the reason for showing this slide is that I think sometimes in terms of public perception, we make the mistake of mistaking noise for volume, which is there are lots of people who are very noisy about their opposition to nuclear power. They don't actually represent the majority of the public by any sense. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't continue to work on public perception, but we shouldn't see it as something which is uniquely related to nuclear. In fact, anywhere you're building any sort of energy infrastructure in the UK, you tend to have people opposed to it, whether that's gas extraction or onshore or offshore wind close to where people live, with the exception of nuclear. With nuclear power, anywhere where we're potentially planning to build, you tend to find those as sites which have had nuclear activity before, and therefore the local community tends to be a significant majority in support of that because they are communities that are used to nuclear and also recognise and have a direct experience of the impact, positive economic impact that comes from it. One other point that's made quite often is that nuclear is not flexible. Nuclear, as everyone in this room I think will know, is flexible. Any nuclear power being built now can be operated, can load follow. You load follow in France in times when all the reactors are on. We sort of did this a little bit a couple of summers ago in the UK. There was an agreement to effectively power down Sizewell B at times when it was very sunny and demand was low because of we were in lockdown. Where nuclear is a significant part, a bigger part, it doesn't need to be characterised as being inflexible. In fact, it is flexible, can be used flexibly. And in the future, in the UK context, where we might be talking about 25% of our mix coming from nuclear, then it may be that we use some of that to load follow, or alternatively to shift between grid electricity and hydrogen production, for example. So different ways of doing it, which ensures that nuclear is flexible. People often talk about how affordable nuclear is and how expensive it is. This slide is relevant, I think, to something we'll maybe come on to discuss, which is financing mechanisms. There's been a significant change in the policy for that in the UK. This is about Hinkley Point C, which Mark will come on to talk about in more detail. But just the point to take from this slide is that the costs of financing and taxation for Hinkley Point C is just more than half of the cost. So it isn't the construction that's expensive, it isn't the engineering that's expensive, it's the cost of capital. Why is the cost of capital so expensive? Partly because it's a long-term asset, partly because there are mechanisms such as the taxonomy, which hasn't yet been introduced in the UK, although we talked about the European one, the CFD mechanism, various other things that add to the cost of capital. Any new nuclear being built in the UK was likely to be built under what's called a regulated asset-based model, which significantly reduces the cost of capital by two factors. One, increasing the pool of investors because the return starts to accrue during the course of construction. And if you increase the pool of potential investors and you enable returns during construction, it both makes it more applicable to a greater proportion of the investment community. And we've seen that interest in the UK in a way which makes it cheaper. And also there's more investors potentially to take a part in it. And that's something which has changed in terms of UK policy ahead of other things I'll just come on to talk about. So nuclear can be more affordable than it is. The argument I'll make about this, even under this mechanism, which looks expensive as a mechanism, go back to where our power price is now and how significant the completed Hinkley Point C will be to dependability in pricing. And even then, my argument would be, even with that mechanism, it's affordable, but it could be more affordable with a different mechanism, which is now being legislated for. I touched on this before, Committee on Climate Change. I'm just going to quickly go through a range of things that have happened in the last 2 to 3 years, and particularly the last 12 months in the UK policy framework that I think have helped to crystallise the approach and demand to nuclear. The first was this, which was how to get to net zero. Basically, twice the amount of demand of electricity capacity that we currently have. and that a significant chunk of that, 38%, needs to be firm power, which is effectively nuclear, potentially carbon capture and storage, although that is negatively impacted by the fact that it's still fossil fuel based, not so much in emissions but in cost of input. So that's where nuclear is a big part of that. To decarbonise to 2050, it's not just about grid electricity, it's about other things as well, and that slide just shows you what some of those are. The cleaner fuels that can be created partly through nuclear electricity and heat are significant, but also remembering that net zero and prosperity and well-being aren't a choice. Going for net zero in the right way enables job creation and economic activity in places around the country and in the supply chain, both domestically and internationally. This is just going back to what I was saying before about our existing fleet. That dark line at the bottom shows you the period that our existing fleet ramps down and goes off up to 2035. You can see from 2030 onwards there is just 1 gigawatt or 1.2, that's Sizewell B. The red line, do nothing, means do nothing other than complete Hinkley Point C. So you can see if you completed Hinkley Point C and Sizewell B and nothing else, we would still be about half of where we were at the start of this decade. Half of where we were in gigawatt terms, a quarter of where we would need to be in capacity terms, so we need to ramp up significantly. And that's what looks like a mountain is. How we get to 2050 and up to 24 gigawatts, possibly beyond that, including large scale, small modular reactors, and then towards the end, probably some of those advanced modular reactor designs then being applicable, particularly for off-grid applications and high temperature heat, which obviously has a potential impact in the efficiency of hydrogen production. So we've got a lot to do in a relatively short period of time. That's why it's important in this context, is because something that was said before about collaboration between the UK, Korea, and the possibility for that is there is a lot to do that is well beyond the capacity of the current nuclear industry in the UK, both here and internationally. The smart thing to do, I think, is through collaboration to be able to deliver in the places that are relevant to ourselves and then more widely in the world. And that collaboration happening now can help to climb that mountain in the UK, but there are similar mountains around the world at the same time. So in the UK context, what's happened in terms of policy over the last year, this goes back a year really to COP26. So COP26 nuclear was visible. Over the course of that autumn, net zero strategy, sorry, I've gone back one by mistake. Net zero strategy and spending reviews started to seriously put some impetus behind nuclear enabling. The Rolls-Royce SMR design has started the process for going through what's called generic design assessments. Money being allocated for development of high-temperature gas-cooled reactor, government investment in development work for Sizewell C. Then over the spring, April particularly, this is when energy security really began something which really began to bite in political terms. And the first 2 points will mean nothing to anyone in this room other than possibly two of us. But the point is, it became high profile as an issue in positive terms, in political discourse amongst politicians, then Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition in both parliaments, the UK Parliament, also in the devolved Scottish Parliament, nuclear debated in positive terms and almost a political discussion about who was going to do it better and more quickly, as opposed to what has been in the past, probably the opposite. The financing mechanism I talked about, the regulated asset base, has been passed into law, so that now exists in law. And then in April, the publication of the British Energy Security Strategy, which the Ambassador referenced. And this is where the 24 gigawatts of new nuclear by 2050 comes from. So up to 24 gigawatts by 2050. Now, when you think about that, that's quite a lot to do. It's about 3 times what we've currently got. And we've got to do it much more quickly than we've done so far with Hinkley, which took a long time to get to the point of construction. There's only really been in construction the last few years. To get towards 25% in the future power mix, which is probably the optimum level that helps to offset the variability coming from a renewables heavy mix, also ensure that there's some firm power for grid balancing, but also in terms of energy security. To get to that sort of figure, that's what we need to do. So we need to do it much more quickly. The government have announced or said they will be starting a body called Great British Nuclear, which we expect announcements on in the next few weeks, I think, for it formally to be established to help to drive as a delivery vehicle, development vehicle, to help drive that activity at a much faster pace than we have before. And that is focused on both large and small reactors. It's not a choice between the two, it's going to be both. There are sites in the UK applicable for large that aren't suitable for, the sites that aren't suitable for large that will be suitable for modular reactors. So it's not a choice, it's about both, I think, to be able to get to meeting that demand. And we've had a lot of political change in the UK. People have noticed we've had 3 prime ministers in the course of a few weeks. Every single one of them, either directly as they've been prime minister or as they've been campaigning to become prime minister, has referenced that 24 gigawatts figure. So the people might have changed, the policy has stayed consistent over that period, and also it's cross-party. So the main opposition party, if there's an election in about 18 months' time, which there probably will be, the main opposition party is also on the same page on this. So at surface level, it might look like a lot of political instability in the UK, but actually that is pretty consistent as a mix. Mark will come on to talk about Hinkley. That's under construction at the moment. Biggest construction project in Europe. First new nuclear since the 1990s. Big amount of UK supply chain, but significant amount that's not. Sizewell C, which is likely to be possibly next week confirmed. I mean, there's been various announcements. Will be a copy of that. Replication benefits. But you know, that isn't going to be the end of the story, as I've said before. And on SMR, there's a Rolls-Royce-led UK consortium design, which is going through its process to be approved. Different model, you know, significantly much more modular, factory-built, transported to site, bolted together. Likely to be a significant part of that future. But I think my final point is to say that whether we're talking about large or small, or so say large and small, there's a lot to do in a short period of time. There is a limited amount of nuclear expertise in the world. When we think about this in global terms, we think about the challenge that exists across the world, both for energy security and for decarbonisation. It actually requires all of us and all of those who are part of that nuclear ecosystem to be working as collaboratively as we always have done, and more so. Because if we don't, we won't get there. And nobody should be thinking about this in terms of in the way they might have thought about it in the past, which is that we've got to protect what we do for ourselves. Actually, there's so much to do that the way of being able to deliver it rests on sensible, rational collaboration and cooperation. And that's something where I'm genuinely hopeful that the UK and Korea and the nature of our relationship, of our country's relationships, can help to really set the scene in that area. So I think that's me with my slides, and it is. So thank you very much.
예, 발표에 감사드립니다. 영국의 원자력 산업에 대한 이해를 높일 수 있는 발표라고 생각합니다. 또한 우리나라도 지금 뭐 전력 가격이 자꾸 올라가서 문제지만 영국이나 유럽은 전력 가격 상승이 우리보다 심한 것 같습니다. 이걸 해결할 수 있는 방법은 뭐 제가 그렇게 잘 이 분야를 알지는 못하지만 원자력이 될 거라고 저도 충분한 생각을 갖게 하는 그런 발표였습니다. 감사드리고요. 두 번째 발표는 영국의 터너 앤 타운센트의 임원이신 마크 사베지 님이 해주시겠습니다. 마크 사베지 님은 터너 앤 타운센트에 23년간 근무 중이며 영국 원자력 발전소인 아까 말씀드린 셀러필드와 힌클리 포인트 C를 담당하셨습니다. 또한 영국 맨체스터 유나이티드의 시즈널 티켓을 가지고 계시답니다. 이게 정말 부럽네요. 마크 사베지님 발표를 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you. Everyone hear me okay? So my presentation, and thank you for the opportunity to allow me, number one, to come to this part of the world, a place I've never been, and a beautiful part of the world, lovely climate, thank you very much. But travel from Manchester in the United Kingdom, and thank you to my partners at Hamley for providing me the opportunity to come and talk. And really, you know, I've spent the majority of my career, and different to Tom's presentation, I'm going to talk much more about projects, and I've spent the majority of my career working in the nuclear industry, from an apprentice engineer through to my time with Turner and Townsend to now leading kind of our nuclear endeavour within the UK, and now leading our global infrastructure team. And as part of the presentation today, I've got 40 minutes. I want to spend a very short period talking about Turner and Townsend, but very relative to this presentation in terms of what we are and what we aren't in the nuclear industry. I'm then going to talk a little bit about our nuclear experience within the UK, because that's quite broad across the full life cycle. And then I'm going to talk in some degree of detail to Hinkley Point C. I have 40 minutes for this presentation, and you'll see in the slide deck there's quite a lot of detail on Hinkley Point C to talk through. And I also, if I have the time, would like to talk about Sellafield. If I eat up the time talking about Hinkley, I may abridge the Sellafield conversation a little more, because I know Hinkley is much more of interest. Point 5 on my slides, our capability, I'm going to take as read because they're in the document pack, so I don't really need to talk to that. So Turner and Townsend, relative to this presentation, but the important point to note with Turner and Townsend is we're an independent organisation. So we don't get involved in technology and engineering. We're much more around how do clients and projects set themselves up for success, and how do we drive performance, and how do we transform performance. So we really operate, and you'll see in the slides that we really operate as an independent. We sit separate to the engineer quite often to give clients impartial advice on where things are progressing. And certainly in the UK context, that's a really important role. You know, in the UK and in other developing, you know, certainly in the Commonwealth nations especially, we see that in Canada and Australia, and it's emerging more in Europe, that role of the independent in making sure projects are set up successfully, governed correctly, and are transparent in how they're performing is a really key role. And working within the nuclear sector, our role in the UK, and I'm going to start in the top left, which is at Sizewell C. So Tom was talking about Hinkley Point C and the replication into Sizewell C. Part of our role working on behalf of EDF with Sizewell C is to demonstrate to stakeholders, investors and the government that is occurring, that replication is realistic and is achievable. And that's based upon our learning we've gathered from Hinkley Point C. So we've moved much more into an assurance role to give guarantees and support the client in reaching their position. Hinkley Point C I'll talk to, but we've been engaged in that project now for over 10 years. And we're engaged financial investment decision all the way through to mobilisation, now supporting them in the project services on site. Magnox, which is the decommissioning of our old gas-cooled reactors across the UK. Our role there was, as part of the decommissioning programme, is much more how do you drive a programmatic approach into the delivery of decommissioning. So where you've got very similar scopes of work in different geographic locations, how do you drive efficiency? So the phrase we use there, and you see that in the Sizewell C piece now, is lead and learn. So how do we do something once, learn from it and lead it to the next position, and then learn from it again, and all the time get more and more efficient. And Sellafield, our longest standing relationship, that's where we've really supported them on, you know, in a very uncertain environment, how do you bring certainty? And you know, often projects are asked to land on a pinpoint 20 years out or 10 years out, which is completely unrealistic, where more so the question should be, how do you get certainty and predictability around the decisions you take, which is what we've really helped that client with into their new delivery models, which we'll talk to around collaboration. A word that you'll see comes through a lot in Hinkley Point C and in Sellafield and in the UK context as a whole in the infrastructure sector is collaboration. How do we work together? So Hinkley Point C, and the picture you see there, Tom showed a picture of the UK kind of strategy paper with this lift from a different angle. And this is one of the containment rings on Unit 1 at Hinkley Point C being lifted into position by the world's biggest crane, Big Carl. And the reason I lead with this picture is because it kind of sets the tone for the scale and the complexity of this project as we go on. You know, everything is the world's biggest or the world's most demanding. You know, it is a huge endeavour. So you can see the crane doing the lift, and sort of around the outside of the containment vessel there, you can see where the pressure vessels are going to be dropped in to do the heat transfer. So in this, what I'm going to talk to is Hinkley Point C as a project, then I'm going to go into some stats and facts, then I'm going to go into sort of some key lessons as you go into the construction sector in the UK and what we're facing. But the Hinkley Point C project, a European pressurised water reactor, EPR, and interestingly, that's based upon what was already approved technology deployed within Europe and China, but yet we're still required to go through the UK generic design assessment process, which took for this project approximately 5 years. So, you know, even though it's approved elsewhere, there's no skipping the process. And this technology and these projects exist in Olkiluoto in Finland, where, you know, this is coming into a phased opening now of this reactor. And that's, you know, if you can see there, that's a 17-year process from start to finish, start of construction to finish. You can see in Flamanville in France, the same technology again, with a 16-year build process into operation next year. And then if we look into Taishan in China, where this reactor is now operational on the 11-year build process, and that's really important when we come to what's going on at Hinkley Point C and the ambitious targets that it set itself. But you can see the stark difference there in delivery. We've talked about what it generates when it's operational, and Tom talked in detail about the strike price. And, you know, this job is delivered by private investment through both French money and Chinese money with some underwriting from the UK government. And Tom talked about the regulated asset-based model. When this project was first agreed to get going, a gentleman called Sir John Armitt wrote the National Infrastructure Committee report, which was about future investment in the UK. And at that point, without the regulated asset-based model, he did say that, you know, they would strongly consider whether new nuclear is achievable under the prices, because exactly what Tom was talking about, the outline capital you see is only half of the value that it's going to cost you. So the regulated asset-based model has been really critical in getting the investment into Sizewell moving and hopefully opening up investment in the future into the nuclear market. And importantly for the UK, when government considers business cases now for major investment, you know, Hinkley Point C is providing 25,000 of employment opportunities. And one of the things that Tom maybe didn't say, but is an opinion of mine, is because we've lacked the policy on committing to nuclear and we've kind of flipped and flopped, we've been in and we've been out, we've had not much commitment into investment in skills. So the importance of Hinkley Point C and the investment in nuclear skills and the Nuclear Skills Academy and getting nuclear engineering back up and going again is critically important. So 25,000 employment opportunities, 60% of the spend in the UK supply chain. And like I said, these are their committed figures of 600 million tonnes of CO2 offset over its 60-year operating life. You know, so the benefits, you know, as well as the electricity certainty in terms of employment and economic generation are significant. And then being project people, hopefully there's some project people in the room as we get into the detail, just to kind of start to bring some colour to the endeavour that this is. So we're looking at an 11-year delivery period for Hinkley Point C, which, if you go back to the previous slide, is much more aligned with what we've achieved in Taishan. And there's a phrase you'll see as I use this as we go through, called J0, which is the pour of the nuclear slab in the units. And actually, from delivering J0 on Hinkley Point C to opening is 10 months more aggressive than Taishan. So, you know, because we lost time at the front end, so there's actually a lot of aggression in this schedule to try and meet the timescales that they've said. Then in terms of the endeavour itself, 11,000 workers at peak construction. And when I come to show some pictures of the site, and when we talk about the skills constraints and the skills capacity in the UK, 11,000 people working on a constrained site delivering the type of scope, it's an enormous endeavour for us. 7,000 work faces, and we'll talk about the complexity of this as we go through, but the handoff between the civil construction of this reactor into the mechanical, electrical and high HVAC systems is enormous, and there could be up to 7,000 work faces that are opened up in doing that. Then we get into the units, and what I do with the units, I like to, when I present, try and bring some context to them so they're not just a number. So we've got nearly 1 million metres cubed of concrete going into Hinkley Point C. And to bring some context to that, 'cause it's very hard to imagine what is 1 million metres cubed of concrete. The Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world in Dubai, which it's some involvement with Korea, it's 330,000 metres cubed of concrete. So we're talking about 3 times the amount of concrete that's gone into the tallest building in the world. You know, so huge amount of construction activity to go on. And 233,000 tonnes of rebar. And again, to give that some context, the Eiffel Tower is estimated at 7,300 tonnes of steel. So you're talking about 31 Eiffel Towers worth of steel that's going into this, all constructed on site, all constructed through a traditional manner of formwork, slip form, pour. So it's a really, really huge construction challenge. 440 kilometres of pipe, 46,000 valves and 7,000 kilometres of cable going in. So kind of given when you know, Tom said the biggest project in Europe, certainly when it comes to a UK construction perspective, when we haven't built one of these for 30 years, you look at those kinds of volumes and those kind of challenges, you start to get a real sense of the enormity of setting up and controlling a scheme like that to get it delivered, not just from the client, but also from the supply chain and the contractors involved. You know, the interface control, the project control, the logistics management, which we'll come to. So hopefully these won't automatic build now, but this is the site. I just want to show the site in 2016. So this is pre-financial investment decision and going into financial investment decision. So again, there's preparatory work being done, but that's much more to do with the environmental impact assessment and giving surety around the planning permissions, etc. If we go forward a year, you can now see that the site's starting to take form, and if I press this red button, is that? It doesn't beam that far. But you can see down in the bottom right-hand side where you're starting to get the first safety-related concrete poured into Unit 1. You can start to see the shape of the reactor taking shape there after a year. If I move on to the next slide. So up on the top right-hand side towards the middle, you can see the pump house now starting to take form. So for those relative to where the geography of this thing is on the Bristol Channel, the water or the sea or the estuary would be above this picture. So the pump house is there taking shape. And then down at the bottom, you can start to see the reactor, kind of the nuclear island taking shape down at the bottom below that. And we've actually had the J0 pour of concrete start. So we're starting to pour the nuclear grade concrete into the slab. As we move into 2019, the tunnel boring machines, which were sacrificial tunnel boring machines, so that they're going to be, they've tunnelled their way into the Bristol Channel and will be forever in there. They're starting up at the top to go into the Bristol Channel, 2 inlets, 1 outlet. The J0 pour is complete. You can see now the concrete at the cross near the lettering. That's now complete, and that was, just to confirm my numbers, 22,000 metres cubed of concrete into that pour alone. And we've got one of the pressure units now on site down there as well. So you can see the progress now really starting to ramp up. And then particularly when we kick into 2020, when COVID kicks in, so the site did continue to operate under COVID, under lots of restrictions. And Unit 2 now, an interesting learning point from Hinkley Point C is that in the top right-hand side, you can see the access to the site. And a key learning point was we should actually have started with Unit 2, because we started building Unit 1 and now we've got to get past it to get to Unit 2 for all the ingress and access to the site. But you can start to see again the reactor taking shape down at the bottom there. And then 2022 as to where we are now, just to give some real context to this. So at the bottom of the screen, you can't actually see it. And I can't beam, sorry. But the HBS simulation building, so what that is that would sit just below the bottom of the picture. So that's a control room that's being built to start the operators into training now around how this is going to operate and what the control room looks like. The marine installation of the 6 heads, that's now way out in the Bristol Channel, and they were off-site fabricated. So one of the only parts of Hinkley Point C that's been off-site fabricated, that they've been made down in Avonmouth and brought up. And the control room in the main reactor building is now taking shape, and that's just to the left-hand side of Unit 1, which is the round circle at the bottom. You can start to see now the control room's now taking shape just to the left of that circle. So you can see in the space of that kind of 6-year period, the amount of construction activity on the site, and this is before we go to the MEH type of work. So huge endeavour, huge support from the supply chain, a very broad and varied supply chain, and hugely challenging through the working conditions that we've been going through. And in terms of, I was asked to talk about how is this organised for delivery. And initially when the project started, it started in an organisation approach. It was very structured around how you get contracts executed. So it was structured around its civils work, its MEH work, its equipment. And what the project realised over time was that wasn't sufficient to manage the amount of interface that we're going to have. So the project is now managed to look at, you look at your 2 funders, so you got EDF and CGN. HPC project is separated as its own generating company, so it operates as its own independent governing body. And then it's structured with a programme director in the nuclear island, the conventional island, and the balance of plant. There'll be another blue box with all the support functions such as HR, finance, project controls, project services, commercial. Didn't show that, but that does exist. So there, if you like, our accountabilities for delivery. There's then transverse programmes. So we have an engineering provider. So even though EDF are the parent body and the engineer, we still, within the realms of this project, must treat them as part of the supplying chain of service. We must keep the reference design under control to keep the construction progressing and not allow it to get out of control and allow them inserting from the side, for example. We have transversing all the equipment so it's consistent, which would probably be really consistent with how you guys do it over here. There's then the civils work, which has been transversed. You can see the progress they've made. And then the mechanical, electrical and HVAC, which some are procured, some are still in procurement. And the complexity of this supply chain, and back to the collaboration, is lots of this is delivered in collaboration. Collaboration with French contractors and UK contractors, collaboration with other European contractors and UK contractors. So it's been a big collaboration based upon the size and the scale of this. And that's recognising the challenges I think the UK has had in, did it have the skills readily available? And could it bring the learning from the other projects that was critical of Flamanville and Okilotu? So bringing that learning in, upskilling the UK supply chain and getting it ready to deliver an endeavour like this has been really key. In terms of challenges, delivery capability and complexity. So I'll show you a rendering in a second to do with what I actually mean by that. But the orange on this chart at the bottom is the amount of civil support that's in the project at the minute. So that's the amount of civil construction that's going on the site. If you look in the middle, you see a large emergence of kind of that off blue colour, which is all the ME and H support that's going to come into site. So the handoff is rapidly approaching, where we'll approach approximately 11,000 people on site. And we'll be doing a handoff between the civils work, which you might class as lower risk, into the MEH work, which becomes much higher risk because of the complexity of this build. And that involves a whole different set of skills types and skills professions that are going to be pulled into this. We are now adopting, and I'll show you on a future slide, much more around 4D. So there's been a lot going on in the UK around BIM strategy and the building information model and how you 3D visualise kind of the asset. What we have done with this scheme now is looked at how do you bring that 3D visualisation of an asset and bring the time aspect in to kind of manage that. But certainly a huge endeavour in terms of the skills challenges that are going to come. And a huge endeavour, because if you look at, what Tom was talking about the UK and nuclear industry, you see a tail off of those skills up to June 27. without a sizable C, we are at real risk of those skills kind of diminishing and disappearing onto other UK major programmes. So having that continuity of nuclear programmes in the UK to replicate and lead and learn is really important for us. Another challenge is productivity and performance. And on something the scale of this, it really is a challenge. And what we're doing to overcome that is, and back to the point on collaboration, what you're seeing at the bottom there is what the project and the contractors work together to understand. So there's been a lot of effort put in the UK around how we collaborate with the supply chain and how we contract with the supply chain under new engineering terms to really be transparent on where performance is so that we can predictably understand where the issues are and work together to solve them. So you can see here in some of the rebar tons and the structural steel work, it is behind schedule. It's behind schedule for all sorts of reasons, to do with weather, to do with COVID. But the point of the joint collaboration is it's not just the job of the contractor to answer the client, how do we resolve that? It's the project team must do that, and the contract terms allow for that. So real challenge is getting productivity and performance up, but the key point of that is about visibility. You know, we track all of the unit quantities with the contractor, in collaboration with the contractor, down at a package level and a workface level, to really build that up to the top. And so, for example, when I was saying that, you know, we're nearly 1 million tonnes of concrete to go into Hinkley Point C, we know, for example, that we're 46% through at the macro level. And that's because we're able to really get down to the micro level to build that back up. But a real challenge for us to keep stakeholders satisfied and build confidence in the project. The civils to M&E handoff, can you press play on this? What we're seeing here is on the left-hand side as you're looking at it is the civil construction of the galleries and the reactor building. So you can see where the curvature is there and how the reactor building is going up over time. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the MEH, which is your water systems, your electrical systems, your fire alarm systems, your HVAC. So what we don't have the opportunity to do on this job is do a modular build where this big module on the right-hand side gets built and it gets shipped to site and it gets inserted into a concrete carsophagus. That isn't how this has been built or constructed. What gets built on the left-hand side is a concrete structure that has all of the openings ready for the module to be constructed on site. So when I talked about 7,000 work faces and enormous ME and H risk into the civil structure, it's because what we're doing is we're taking what you see on the right and we're putting it into what's being built on the left. What we're not doing is building a concrete box and floating that in and inserting it. So there's a lot of on-site welding. We have to make sure that when the concrete structure goes up, the openings are in the right place to take the pipe work and the duct work where they need to go. So highly, highly complex build. And in terms of 4D planning, you know, one of the real examples of where 4D planning really allows us to kind of take that 3D building information model and map it to time to start to see where those things, when we can start to get in and start installing these assets. And then the other challenge is around logistics. And based on everything you've just seen, you know, the project is a logistical monster. And you sometimes forget when you endeavour on these projects within the UK, you forget as part of your planning application and your environmental application and everything that goes with that is there's a whole suite of commitments that go with how much power do you plan to use, how much waste are you going to generate, where are all these people going to sit, where are they going to live. So you can see here that as we look across the top, you can see how we're planning to and tracking the power that we use, how we tracking the fuel that's being used, the construction staff on site, the people on site, the wastewater that we're using. The bylaw is one of the contractors, how much waste the civil... So we're tracking not only all the quantities to build the job, but we're also tracking all of the logistical elements that constitute giving confidence that the job is doing everything it's doing. So it isn't deliver at all cost, it's deliver and meet the prerequisite requirements that you set out within your requisite applications. So hugely challenging job, and but some of the points on replication. So you saw there that the lift of the ring going in at the start with the crane Big Carl, Unit 2 achieved that lift 2.5 months faster than Unit 1 did. So the whole point on the replication opportunity is in Hinkley Point C, taking learning from Flamanville, Olkiluoto and Taishan, but also as we bring that into Sizewell C, our role is then to say, well, what's the most reasonable and fair time that we can expect this project to deliver, and at what type of cost based upon what we've seen on Hinkley Point C. So it's a learning adventure as much as a delivery adventure to make sure that we build that learning, replicate, take the efficiency and move on. So hopefully that's given you a flavour for the size of the project, the scale of the project, and some of the techniques that are being deployed within the UK to deliver that project in terms of giving confidence. As I move to the other end of the spectrum, so whereas Hinkley's a new facility, at Sellafield what we have is an existing facility. And Sellafield in context, so the first operational nuclear reactor, Chapplecross and Magnox, they were opened in the 50s, and the picture in the top right is, as you can see, the Queen opening that. So it was the first ever nuclear reactor to put electricity into the UK grid. But also Sellafield was a critical asset in the development of UK's nuclear capability. Obviously, in times gone by, the world was different, and the Sellafield played a big part in where the UK sits on a broader nuclear scale. And because of that, it's created a large amount of legacy concern and legacy issue that pose a significant risk to the UK. So there's a 120-year programme in place to remediate and create safe storage on the site. And this is a wholly public-funded programme of work. So it's regarded as a public liability, and as such, the public purse pays for this. And when Tom was talking about nuclear, a big part when I was starting out in nuclear was the association of decommissioning cost in the build cost as well, in terms of what the full cost of that is and the liability is. And the Sellafield life cycle, to put that in context, is, new facilities now, we know we design them with decommissioning in mind. We know that's when we build a reactor now, we're building it thinking about how we decommission it. We know when we're building storage facilities, we're thinking about the long term. Sellafield's legacy facilities weren't built in that manner, and as such, the Sellafield life cycle involved a lot of characterisation and retrievals works. So for a long, long period, Sellafield, it was actually characterising what they were dealing with, understanding what actually was in there that needed dealt with, which then leads to new facilities being built as enablers that mitigate that risk, that you could then design, build, operate, post-operational clean out, decommission as such over the life cycle. And a lot of work at Sellafield could be classed as abortive because we were trying to build facilities at the time without fully understanding what we were trying to deal with, without characterising and properly understanding what we were trying to deal with. So a lot of challenges around predictability at Sellafield in the early days, which is now being worked through. But some data points. It's a site that measures over 6 square kilometre, which when I Googled the size of Seoul, I think makes it about 1% of the size of Seoul. So trying to put that in some type of context for you. And it makes up around 14 kilometres around the perimeter. So again, a really big site in terms of what goes on there. And really when it looks forward into its strategy, very space constrained. Its annual funding is approximately 2 billion a year, and that's of public money to look after that site and mediate it safely. And it employs 11,000 people and associates itself with about 40,000 in the supply chain. So it's a big economic driver in keeping it going. Not only are you remediating the risk, but it's a high employment level as well. And invests a lot in research and development as well. And the 4 biggest and highest hazards in Europe from a nuclear perspective in terms of high-level waste and the original nuclear legacy. And their organisational approach, I heard people earlier talking about BEIS, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Group, who govern. So BEIS are the ultimate funder of Sellafield on behalf of the UK government. The Nuclear Decommissioning Authority operates as a second line of assurance over them. So really adopting assurances is being spended wisely and is the taxpayer getting value for money. And then Sellafield Limited is structured around what it calls value streams. And those value streams are accountable for strategy and outcome. So they would say in retrievals, the strategy is this. In remediation, the strategy is this. Spent fuel management, which is something that's coming to an end now, reprocessing has ended, and special nuclear materials. So that it's value streams that determine the strategy for the site and what the outcomes are. And they're enabled by projects and their support functions. A big change at Sellafield to draw upon here, and this is a change in the UK nuclear industry and construction industry, I think, is Sellafield would traditionally buy on a transactional project-by-project model, which, if you're looking at skills development and capability development, leads to a transient model, because you resource up to a project. If you don't see surety of pipeline, you resource down and move elsewhere. So one of Sellafield's challenges on capability and skills development was about changing its delivery model. And as part of what we have in the UK is we have something called Project 13, which is the infrastructure clients group, where they've come together and looked at more collaborative delivery models. And what Sellafield have looked to do is go, we commit to a portfolio of work that looks like this over this duration, and we want to put a supply chain together that is very collaborative and allows us access to capability across skills of construction, design and integration, which would be your typical project management consultants. So a really long-term collaborative relationship, which you start to see in the rail sector, you're starting to see in the nuclear sector in Hinkley Point C, and we'll expect to see in Sizewell C. So that spirit of collaboration, and somebody said in the opening, you know, we're better when we're together. You know, I think that whole collaboration piece is a big theme in the nuclear sector now. The next piece is cost and schedule predictability. So typically projects at Sellafield have taken 3 years longer than planned and cost at least 50% more than they were budgeted. With the new delivery models and the new contracting models, what we've looked to do is balance schedule and cost predictability in how the supply chain works. So we independently assure a baseline, we work from a baseline, and 50% of everything that is saved against the baseline is generated as profit for the supply chain. So they have the opportunity, and when we took this model through UK government, which I was part of, it was a real step forward for UK government in understanding that the supply chain should have the opportunity to make really healthy profit. What we shouldn't be doing is creating a supply chain where we're commercially managing them so they don't invest and support themselves. So what we've done is create a model here where the supply chain can invest, can make healthy profit, but it only accesses it if it achieves schedule. And on the first 2 projects through the pot there, you see at least 20% savings already on what they're predicting the outturn to be for the project. And we see at least 20% saving on the schedule predictability. And that's because it's in their interest, because it provides them the opportunity to really, in some points, double their profit opportunity from not performing. So new model, and something that we're starting to see more and more of in the UK. And in terms of, you know, benchmarking, how do you benchmark something that's never been done before? So what we put a lot of time into working with Sellafield is working against project management metrics. So, you know, rather than trying to benchmark something that's never been done before in an environment you've never done it before, which is quite difficult, how do you look at the outliers around some major project metrics? So what do we expect typically project management to total project spend to look like? And if you're in line with what we see as a UK average, then we're okay. If we're too high, then we need to have a conversation. And equally, if we're too low, we're not likely to make the profit we should. So equally, let's have a conversation. So that's the model we adopt now at Sellafield, is supply chain has the opportunity to make good profit in collaboration based upon a set of assured baselines and cost plans that can demonstrate they have the opportunity if they deliver correctly. And the final piece on Sellafield with challenges in new ways of working, technology and digital. So a lot of, you know, we always say with digital, what can be repeated can be automated. You know, the whole theory, if you can generate a process and if you can repeat something, you can automate it. Then, you know, what goes on at Sellafield now, we've got automated working with robots. So in the top left, you can see a robot that looks like something from Black Mirror or War of the Worlds, but you know, these are robots now that are being deployed into radiologically hazardous areas that allow us more productivity, but also importantly much more safety for individuals working on site. You can see in the bottom middle there, we're using ROVs to characterise the waste. And I won't show you the render because it's very similar to the previous one you saw. But the render on the right, when you play it, is showing you how they're using technology to really understand the space constraints on the site, to understand the craneage clashes. I assume you get a copy of this slide deck and then you can play that and you'll be able to see how that plays out and how it kind of helps mitigate the risks before you start construction on site and before you lead into the challenges on site.
This is a quick video demonstration of the features this piece of software has. So there's AI that will be, after 30 seconds, will simulate a fire escape sequence. There's points around the map to collect.
Play to a point where you can see a crane clash and then we can turn it off, just quite long.
Animations. At the click of a button, so the crane will set to move.
So you can see how we're using it now much earlier in the process to kind of understand where the clashes are in construction. So again, bringing that 3D model together with the time-related schedule to really mitigate the risk early in the process. Capability in our sector, I think I've touched on that as I've gone through it. And again, an example in there from the aviation sector, because obviously I can't share detailed asset information from nuclear facilities. But when you do get this slide deck, which I assume is going to be shared, you don't need to play it. It really shows you how we're bringing to life the digital twin. So we use a lot of language in the UK around the digital twin and digital first delivery. And that video, when you see it, it's from an aviation client in the Middle East, where it's the first client in the world on a mega project that we've seen in the sector, where we've been able to move the design model into the asset management unit, time relate it, and start to see the proper walkthrough of the digital twin before the asset goes live. And that was me. Thank you very much for listening. I know there's quite a lot of detail there, so to canter to, but thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 많은 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 터너 앤 타운센스라는 회사의 소개뿐만 아니라 셀러필드하고 hinkley 포인트 C의 사업 내용, 또한 새로운 신기술에 대해서도 들을 수 있습니다. 다시 한번 두 분의 발표에 대해서 감사드립니다. 자, 그럼 이제 토론의 시간을 갖겠습니다. 토론 진행은 서울대학교 서균열 교수님이 맡아주시겠습니다. 서 교수님은 MIT에서 핵기계공학 박사를 받으시고 서울대 명예교수로 계십니다. 또한 태평양 원자력협회 회장을 역임하셨고요. 현재 국제원자력관리원 정회원이시고 주식회사 필로소피아 대표이사를 맡고 계십니다. 이제 마이크를 서균열 교수님께 넘기겠습니다. 서 교수님, 토론 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. Very good afternoon to you. I'm Kyun, Seoul National University, and I'm super excited to be chairing as well as moderating this session, a very, very important session. And as you may know, we are most likely the first generation to be entering the fourth industrial revolution, and most likely the last generation to be worrying about upcoming climate calamity. So it is in this very context that I am inviting you all to the theme of this meeting, or heart and mind of this session, which is how to keep nuclear afloat, okay, in the midst of industrial revolution and climate change. And I believe Mark has already given us the answer. Together, the better, okay? So in the meantime, I thought about 4 bullet items relating to this discussion. And that has to do with, first of all, large power plants. We'll be exchanging field experience as well as lessons learned. And we'll be talking about good practices as well as bad practices, okay? And then we'll be moving on to small modular reactor, which is so sexy that everybody seems to be jumping on this, okay? So possible collaboration between the two countries, or organizations relating to research, development, and deployment. And number 3, this is even sexier than number 2, nuclear hydrogen production. And we'll be looking into ways to produce hydrogen using nuclear, and we'll be touching upon both low temperature and high temperature electrolysis, most of all, okay? And 4th, decontamination, dismantling, as well as decommissioning. And I think we have a lot to learn from the UK side as far as this very topic is concerned. And last but not least, I'm personally interested in the so-called 4 plus D-dimensional technology. According to Einstein, 4th dimension is the last one, but I just found that there's another one. Okay, 3-dimensional space, time, there was money coordinate system, which is just found. So I call this 4 plus D technology, which is in fact the same as 4D technology, based upon 3-dimensional modeling. So with this in mind, I think we can go on to the discussion, and in the interest of both Tom and Mark, I think the Korean speakers actually want 4 of us can make some briefings, 5 minutes. And I do mean 5 minutes sharp, no more lectures, okay? Taking turns from my very right side here. Can you take micro from here?
예, 안녕하십니까. 한전의 손 김경민입니다. 우선 한전에 대한 소개를 좀 하겠습니다. 한전은 여러분 아시다시피 국내 최대 공기업으로서 국내에서는 송변전, 배전 판매, 그리고 또 해외에서는 해외 사업을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 국내에서는 한수원을 포함해서 6개 발전 자회사를 통해서 전력과 전력 생산까지 하고 있고, 지금 해외 사업의 경우는 원자력을 비롯해서 화력, 신재생, 송변전 분야에서 현재 24개국 50개의 다양한 프로젝트를 현재 개발 중에 있습니다. 원자력은 2009년 바르카 사업의 그 아랍에미리트 바르카 원전 사업을 수주했고, 지금 현재는 2기를 준공했으며 2기는 내후년까지, 나머지는 내후년까지 마무리 단계에 있습니다. 저도 사실 작년 말에 거의 5년 동안 근무하고 들어와서 지금 추가적인 해외 사업 개발을 하고 있습니다. 그리고 현재 추진하고 있는 원전 사업은 영국을 비롯해서 사우디, 튀르키예, 남아공, 우즈벡, 베트남 등 원전 도입국을 대상으로 다양한 수주 활동을 수행하고 있습니다. 사우디 사업은 2017년 입찰 사묘 의향서를 착수를 했냐 그때부터 시작해가지고 현재 입찰서 제출을 좀 준비하고 있습니다. 그리고 튀르키예 사업 같은 경우는 기존에 한 2번 정도 계속 우리가 초래를 했었는데 시도를 했다가 좀 안 됐고요. 현재 올 4월부터 터키 정부에서 한전의 사업 참여를 공식적으로 요청해서 현재 터키 정부와 사업 협력 방안을 논의하고 있습니다. 그리고 남아공 같은 경우는 지난달에 제가 한번 갔다 왔었는데 그쪽에 비즈니스 포럼 관련해 가지고 협력 세미나를 참석했고 내년에 입찰서가 발행될 예정입니다. 그리고 우즈벡 같은 경우는 작년 11월 우즈벡의 원자력청과 원자력 협력 각서를 체결하고 지금 현재 러시아 로사톰과 로사톰은 저 누클리어 쪽, 우리 한국은 더빈 날랜드 전체 그것을 지금 참여 방안에서 논의 중에 있습니다. 또 추가로 베트남은 그동안 원자력을 중지했는데 그쪽에 정부 측 관련된 사람들하고 우리 공동 연구를 해서 기존의 원자력 발전소 정지된 중지된 것을 다시 재개하는 것을 서로 정책 자료를 만들기로 했습니다. 예, 이상입니다.
Thanks for your real briefings. Okay, then move on to next one.
예, 안녕하십니까. 저는 산업통상자원부 원전수출 진흥과에서 원전수출 지원 TF 팀장을 맡고 있는 김동환이라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. 저는 앞서 차관님께서 말씀하셨던 양국 간의 원전 협력 방안에 대해서 좀 추가적으로 말씀드리고 또 한국의 원전 강점에 대해서 또 원전 산업 정책에 대해서 전반적인 소개를 좀 해드리도록 하겠습니다. 앞서 차관님께서 축사를 통해서 양국이 원전 협력을 할 수 있는 3가지 방안에 대해서 언급을 하셨습니다. 제가 좀 더 추가적으로 설명을 해보자면 우선 우리 정부는 원자력을 탄소 중립 달성을 위한 핵심 축으로 생각하고 있습니다. 이를 위해서 지난 7월 새 정부 에너지 정책을 수립하였고 이 정책에는 신한울 3, 4호기 건설 재개와 2030년까지 원전 비중을 약 30% 이상으로 높인다는 내용을 담고 있습니다. 또한 추가적으로 원전 생태계 복원을 위해서 원전 수출을 적극적으로 지원하고 30년까지 10기를 수출하겠다라는 그런 목표를 천명한 바 있습니다. 영국 또한 2050년까지 최대 8개의 신규 원전을 건설하고 에너지원에서 원자력 비중을 25%까지 높이는 목표를 갖고 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 원자력을 탄소 중립과 에너지 안보의 핵심 수단으로 삼는다는 점에서 한국의 새 정부 에너지 정책과 영국의 에너지 전략은 꽤나 많이 닮아 있습니다. 이러한 정책적 유사성이 원전 분야에서 양국이 가진 서로 다른 장점과 합쳐지면서 한양 간 원전 협력의 가능성을 확대시키고 있다고 생각하고 있습니다. 이를테면 한국 원전은 대형 원전 건설 분야에서 경제성과 짧은 건축 기간 그리고 지난 40여 년간 단 한 건도 없는 중대 사고 이것이 중요한데요. 이러한 그 사고 없이 우수한 기술로 잘 알려져 있습니다. 여기에 대해서는 제가 한 4가지 정도로 좀 상세하게 설명드리고자 합니다. 첫 번째로 40년 동안 원전을 안정하게 건설하는 것에 대한 구체적인 내용으로는 총 28개의 원전을 건설하였고 26개의 원전을 운영 중이고 현재 6개의 원전을 건설 중입니다. 특히 6기는 신고리 3, 4호기와 신한울 1, 2호기 그리고 바라카 3, 4호기입니다. 또한 이러한 축적된 경험을 바탕으로 우수한 사업 역량을 확보하고 있습니다. 사업 관리 효율화 등을 통해 전 세계 최저 수준의 건설 단가를 달성하였고 또 계획된 예산과 공기를 준수하며 경쟁력을 증명하고 있습니다. 현재 저희 정부가 온 타임 온 버짓이라고 캐치프레이즈를 따서 세일즈하고 있는 그런 면입니다. 또한 1000여 개 이상의 국내 기자재 서비스 업체를 바탕으로 탄탄한 공급망을 구축하였습니다. 세 번째로 세계 최고 수준의 안전성과 기술성을 국제사회에서 입증한 바 있습니다. 특히 NRC, 미국의 NRC, 유럽의 EUR 등으로부터 표준 설계 인가를 받았습니다. 마지막으로 바라카 사업을 통해 한국의 해외 원전 사업의 역량을 증명해냈습니다. 중동의 사막 환경, 문화 차이, 본국과의 거리 등의 요인에도 불구하고 바라카 1, 2호기를 성공적으로 준공하였고 3, 4호기 또한 순차적으로 준공할 예정입니다. 영국의 사례를 말씀드리면 윈드스케일 원자로와 세라필드 연료시설 해체 등의 그 경험을 바탕으로 원전 해체 분야에서 명성을 쌓아가고 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 즉 다시 말해서 한국은 원전 건설 분야에서 영국은 원전 해체 분야에서 서로 도움을 줄 수 있을 것이라고 생각합니다. 양국은 이미 한영 원전산업 대화체를 통해 해체 기술 관련 협의를 이어오고 있습니다. 같은 맥락에서 저는 원전 건설 분야와 기타 분야에서도 협력이 필요하다고 생각합니다. 한국이 영국 원전 사업에 진출하는 경우 영국은 안전하고 경제적인 원전을 계획된 기간 내에 가질 수 있을 것입니다. 한국과 영국, 영국과 한국은 이미 원전 분야의 협력 필요성에 대해 깊이 공감하고 지난 2014년부터 4차례 원자력 산업 대화체를 운영하고 있습니다. 이를 통해 대형 신규 원전뿐만 아니라 SMR, 4세대 원전 개발, 폐로 및 R&D 등 관련된 분야에 많은 협의를 해오고 있습니다. 이러한 노력들이 가시적인 성과로 이어질 경우에 탄소 중립 및 에너지 안보 목표에도 더욱더 가까워질 뿐만 아니라 제3국 원전 시장에서도 원전 건설, 해체, SMR 등의 공급망을 아우르는 경쟁력 있는 원팀이 될 것으로 생각합니다. 이상입니다.
All right, let's move on to the next one, please.
예, 안녕하십니까. 현대건설 원자력사업단장 최영입니다. 저희 현대건설은 현재까지 62개국 870여 건의 해외 프로젝트를 수행하여 왔습니다. 그 중에서 저희 현대건설이 시공한 원자력 발전소는 총 22기를 수행하였으며 저희 현대건설이 단독 혹은 주관사로 시공하였습니다. 현대건설이 시공한 대한민국 첫 해외 수출 원전인 바라카 원전은 사막이라는 특수한 환경에서도 추가 비용 없이 공기를 완벽하게 지켰다는 점에서 UAE 당국자들은 물론 신규 건설을 추진하는 다른 국가들에도 강렬한 인상을 남기고 있습니다. 1971년 고리 원전부터 대한민국 원전 역사가 50년인데 전문 인력을 보유한 사업 파트너를 유지하며 사업을 지속해온 현대건설은 국내에서 유일하며 해외에서도 그 유례를 찾아보기 힘든 상황입니다. 저희는 UAE 원전 시공 시 최대 21개국 2만 명의 인원을 동시에 투입하는 대형 원전으로서 당시 현대건설은 4기 호기를 포함한 총 8기 호기를 동시에 시공하는 세계 최고의 원전 건설 시공 능력을 갖추게 되었습니다. 저희 현대건설은 기존의 강점을 가지고 있는 대형 원전 시공 외에도 원전 해체, 사용 후 해결료 처리 시설, SMR 등 원전 사업 전 분야에서 기술 내재화를 통해 사업 전반에 걸친 역량을 확대해 나가고 글로벌 원전 사업의 게임 체인저로서 입지를 강화할 예정입니다. 또한 저희 현대건설은 대형 원전 건설 중심에서 SMR, 원전 해체 사업 등 원전 산업 전 분야를 수행 가능한 토탈 솔루션 푸더바이더로 거듭나고자 합니다. 전문성과 경쟁력을 두루 갖춘 글로벌 플레이어로 건설의 가치를 높이고 인류의 행복 증진에 기여하는 저희들의 여정에 변함없는 성원과 격려를 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Last but not least.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저는 두산에너빌리티의 강홍규입니다. 두산에너빌리티는 이전에 두산중공업이라고 불렀는데요. 지난 3월 달에 두산에너빌리티로 회사명을 바꿨습니다. 이 두산에너빌리티라는 뜻은 청정 에너지를 개발해서 지구가 서스테너빌리티를 유지할 수 있도록 하겠다는 저희의 비전을 담은 사명이라고 할 수 있겠습니다. 저희 두산에너빌리티는 공장이 창원에 있는데요. 이 창원에 있는 공장은 원자로 제작에 필요한 주단 소재부터 제작을 해서 최종 조립까지 할 수 있는 세계에서 유일한 공장입니다. 저희 두산에너빌리티는 1980년대부터 원자로 설비 제작에 참여를 해서 지금까지는 원자로 34대, 증기발생기 124대를 한국, 중국, 미국, UAE에 공급을 해왔습니다. 또한 저희는 원전 주기기 제작뿐만 아니라 서비스, 해체, 또 캐스크, 다양한 방면으로 사업을 확대하고 있습니다. 최근에는 SMR이 곽강을 받으면서 저희도 선제적으로 투자를 하면서 SMR 사업에 참여를 하고 있습니다. 네, 감사합니다.
Okay, actually I've spent almost 50 years, half a century, until my hair got gray, but looks like we have a dream team today as far as this exchange of information is concerned, so let's keep it up as far as we can do. So my idea is that basically we have covered large power plants. I think we got ways of communication between Hinkley Point C and probably Baraka nuclear units, and possibly between Townsend as far as small modular reactors concerned, Rolls-Royce, and looks like hydrogen is not quite here, but I'll just make it up for you guys just in case. And also a bit of decommissioning, because the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is that without the consideration of decommissioning, we're not even building one. This is the must. It has to be considered upfront. Without this, we cannot go into any further construction or operation period. So that's why I put this into this agenda here. And actually, I also like to use my chairman's power to give actually 5 more minutes for the floor because to me 10 minutes was just cruelly short. Okay, so I'll be giving 5 more minutes for the floor presentation. So please jot down your burning questions on the path, whatever which might be circulating. So let's get started from this point. Any comments or potential questions back and forth between basically probably over here and you, Mark?
Is this on? Yeah, it's on. I can hear myself. It's always terrible. I suppose, you know, I work in a project environment, and I have my own observations, which I'll be happy to share in terms of the challenges in the UK and elsewhere in the world. But I'd be keen from, you know, listening to the credibility and the case study that the panel has just talked through there in terms of projects delivered always safely, on time. I'd be keen to understand how, in the environments you've worked in, you achieve that in such an unpredictable manner. Because certainly in the UK and in other environments, we're, and even our head of the Infrastructure Projects Authority once said, we're asking projects 12 years before they're finished to tell us when they're going to land on a pinpoint, you know, which is a completely unrealistic ask of a project. So we're going through this learning journey to kind of go, how do we get much more mature around talking about envelopes and talking about certainty as opposed to fixing on a date. So I'd be keen to understand from the Korean perspective in that major project environment around new nuclear, how has it overcome that desire for people to be obsessed by that singular date that is so hard to predict?
Anybody can volunteer to quench his thirst? Yeah, go ahead.
예, 사실 예상도 못한 건데, 예, 저도 거기에 한 5년 동안 근무를 했었고요. 그 사전에 사실 2009년도에 9년도 말에 계약을 해서 작년에 1호기를 이제 준공을 했고요. 또 2호기 올해 준공했고 내년 3호기, 4호기, 내후년 4호기 준공을 합니다. 그래서 사실 우리 같은 경우는 사실 제가 생각에는 그렇습니다. 우리 한 팀 코리아로 돼 있거든요. 그래서 실제로 국내에서 계속 원자력 발전소를 계속 지어왔고 반복적으로, 그리고 또 가장 중요한 게 사실 기자재라든가 기자재 공급이라든가 엔지니어링이라든가 이런 것은 큰 문제가 없을 것 같아요. 단지 현대건설 상무님 오셨지만은 시공 쪽이 가장 사실 큰 어려움이죠. 우리나라와 완전히 다른 사막 환경, 그리고 또 제3국, 특히 제3국 인력을 아까 힌커리 포인트에 한 10,000명 정도 했는데 그냥 한 부지에 10,000명 정도 근무했다 그러는데, 거기 같은 경우는 한 피크 때 3만 명이 현장에 근무했습니다. 현장에 근무했고, 그때 단 이제 힌커리 포인트는 2기지만 우리 바라카는 4기이기 때문에 조금 그런 차이는 있습니다. 아무튼 저희가 계속 반복적인 건설과 팀 코리아의 역량, 그걸 가지고 했고, 그리고 또 발주차와 계속 문제점과 해결하면서 사실 매일 발주처와 회의를 하고 있습니다. 그래서 주간 매일 공정회의를 하고 있고, 또 공정이 미리 또 예측을 하고 또 지연되면 계속 그거에 대한 커렉티브 액션을 계속 하고, 그런 식으로 해가지고 공정을 좀 맞춰왔습니다.
I think it's a good starting point because as I see it, EPR has been sort of suffering from the delay after delay, and that happened in Finland as well as in France, and it got a little better over in China, and it's getting much better back home. But I believe we got a better experience as far as the idea of staying on time and on budget I think there is certainly something that could be exchanged, and then that could be some lessons learned from their experience over in the desert, plus yours, because you will be very much concerned about any potential delay in the future, because though this is really a good starting point, and this has been, say, first time in 30-some years, as far as UK is concerned. So you should be setting up a very high example as far as this is concerned. So anything coming back to him?
I think, you know, summarising what I heard is your success comes, your team career thing, I think, is the point. It's, you've, you know, what I've jotted down there is you're delivering through a proven supply chain, you know, and you're delivering through a proven supply chain with a proven product. And you know, if I think of these things as a production line, you know, you're kind of going, we know what we're producing, we've got facilities set up to produce it, we know where we're sending it to, and we know what our supply chain is to execute. So it's kind of what you've got is a very kind of systemized and regimented approach to how you deliver effectively.
And I just was wondering if the so-called 4D technology, is it really helping on the field, or is it just a kind of principle thing, or just a paperwork? Is it really a big help as far as the field work is concerned, in terms of reducing the construction period as well as reducing the construction fund?
I think, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the term project controls or project services, you know, scheduling, cost management, risk management. I think the whole point of project controls is it mitigates risk. So you don't just do it for the purposes of doing it because it produces nice reports and, you know, nice renders like you saw on that chart. I think without the 4D planning on Hinkley Point C around the interface between the build of the civil structure and how you're then manually inserting what ideally you would make as a module that you would fabricate in a shipyard or one of your big yards and float over and, you know, insert into a big cast. I think without that 4D planning and understanding when does that room finish, when does the opening finish that we can now start to insert the pipework through, and when does the next room finish so that we can start to proceed with the weld and get that ongoing fabrication going, I think the project would take a lot longer than what it's currently planned to take. And I think a lot of that learning was brought through from Flamanville. I think they had some of those challenges at Flamanville where they didn't use those types of technologies, where they would build the civil structure, the M&E people would turn up to fit out and find that holes weren't where they maybe should have been, rooms weren't ready for them to turn up into. So, you know, hence rework, demobilisation. So I think in that environment, I think it adds a lot of value. So I think if you were ticking the box of constrained, high number of interfaces, high number of work faces, lots of people in the same place at the same time, I think that's where it really adds value.
Could I just go back to the point you were making about EPR and the experience in other places ahead of the UK? Actually, there's a factor there which I don't think we've necessarily quite appreciated, which is being built in different places, although it's the same reactor technology, because of the different regulatory requirements in each different place, there are changes to the design. So whilst Hinkley Point C is, in effect, the fourth EPR project globally to get started, it's the first one with UK specifications that have been determined through the generic design assessment for the regulatory process. And actually what we're starting to see from Unit 1 to Unit 2 at Hinkley is an improvement in deliverability and time. And when you think about it logically, that's not surprising, because you've got a supply chain that's been mobilised to deliver a project that hasn't been delivered in the UK before doing the first one. Same people doing the second one straight after having done the first one, and therefore, you know, you learn how to do it, and therefore the things that you did that you didn't need to do, or the order of you doing things, which means you do the next one more quickly. The trick that we will have is with Sizewell C, which would effectively be the third and fourth units of EPR in the UK. If the timing's right, then it will be a lot of the same, not just the same companies, but a lot of the same people. And so that learning extends, and that fleet replication effect has its maximum benefit. Now, my understanding of Baraka we use a lot in the UK as an example to say to people who say to us all the time, well, the trouble with you lot, that nuclear industry, you don't ever deliver anything on time and on budget. And you say, well, that's not true, actually, and I use Baraka as an example. Now, obviously, there are different circumstances you've touched on in terms of indigenous workforce, planning systems, all sorts of things that are specific to that area. But what I was interested in was how far, given the number of units there are, has the same impact been felt from the first to the second to the third to the fourth in terms of efficiency of delivery? Because if that is the case, then actually rather than say, then what we've got and what we think we're going to have in the UK is actually a very good, sound evidence base for the reasons why you would build a fleet and the benefits of a replication effect, which we haven't really had in the UK before, because either what we've done with our current fleet is they're all a bit different, or we said we're going to do a fleet and we did one, Sizewell B, and then didn't do any more because North Sea oil gas came along and various other things. So we've never actually done what is the most logical thing, an evidence-based thing to do. But actually, both our cases, I think, give a really strong evidence base to why that's exactly what you should do. And that's of relevance and benefit to the global challenge in all of the countries around the world that are interested in nuclear.
Okay, sounds like you're definitely learning the lessons from the current one before you move on to the next unit. And you're doing it in sort of virtual reality as well as physical reality, so that you can definitely reduce the time and money for next unit. That's kind of the message that you're trying to convey to us, okay? And so probably so much for 4+D technology, and then probably we need to move on to the next topic, because I was told that you've got many questions to ask these guys, so you two stay alert, okay? Stay cool.
네, 저 미스터 타운 그레이트렉스께 질문을 드리려고 하는데요. 발표 내용 중에서 영국 국민들의 원자력에 대한 긍정적인 인식이 79%가 된다고 하셨습니다. 원전 건설에 있어서 주민의 수용성과 또한 대중의 그 긍정적인 인식이 참으로 중요하다고 생각이 되는데, 영국에서는 어떻게 이렇게 긍정적인 인식이 79%가 됐는지, 어떤 교육이나 계몽이랑 이런 활동이 있는지 이런 게 궁금합니다.
I was pleasantly surprised to see the figure myself.
To answer the question, yes, we do activity constantly as an organisation on behalf of the industry to be able to explain what nuclear is. But actually, it's reality that gives you those figures, because there's three bits of this reality. The first reality is people who are curious about where we get our electricity from are often surprised to find how much we get from nuclear and how clean it is. But once they understand that, they very quickly accept the proposition that it should be part of a mix. That's the first thing. The second reality is the one we're living through at the moment, and the reason why I think in that graph I showed it went up from when we did it in April this year to 79% from about 75% when we did it a year before that, is that people can see that an over-reliance on burning fossil fuels for your power has a detrimental economic impact that goes across the whole of the economy, as well as understanding that moving away from fossil fuels is pretty integral to addressing the impact of climate change. So those two things, those bits of reality come together, and that helps to influence it. But I think the point I would make about that slide is it's changed a little bit, but it's broadly been the same for as long as we've asked those questions. So the point I was trying to make in my presentation, the thing about that tells me, and should tell everybody, I think, who's curious about this, is that whilst public perception is important, whilst it's important that we continue as we do to not just promote the industry but explain what it is, we shouldn't start from a point of thinking everybody's against us. And I think, as somebody who came into this industry from outside, that that's the impression I get of this industry often, that it thinks lots of people are against us, that nobody understands it, that and there's a sort of defensive mindset which isn't needed, absolutely isn't needed, because it doesn't accord with reality. We should be confident and clear about what we can contribute, and we should talk not just to ourselves, as we're doing a bit today, but we should talk more widely in wider public circles, and that's how you maintain, I think, that broad support.
It's a good point, Tom, because as you may know, that we have survived the 5 year of nuclear phase out, and we're really barely coming out of that. We're just coming out of the woods by now. And my point is that the national policy has better be based upon science and statistics rather than politicians. But it's quite unfortunate that we've been suffering from this kind of decision making between nuclear phase out versus renewables. I think these two resources should go together, the better. But somehow it's become a victim to political agenda. So I think that's where he's coming from. Okay? So if there's anything you can add on to...
Politicians, and I speak as a recovered one, take their lead often from what they think they see and hear out there. And if what they see and think they hear out there, because it's coming from us as an industry sometimes, is a defensive mindset or a feeling that, well, no one really understands us. If only understood the science, it'd all be fine. When that's not necessarily drawn from reality, that influences sometimes, I think, the way in which politicians and political actors look and feel and how they react to arguments and how they respond to issues. Our best argument, I think, in this, and has always been, has consistently been for as long as I've been involved in this, not doing this job, but also previously when I was a politician, is what are the big challenges we have to address? Decarbonisation and energy security. How do you best tackle those with a mix, a low carbon mix as possible? How do you get the mix that is optimum to provide all the features we want? And you do that not by saying it's nuclear versus renewables. It isn't. You know, it's about how you best calibrate that mix of the low carbon technologies. And look, in the UK, we'd be quite lucky because our organisation and our equivalent in the renewable sector work quite closely together on lots of things, because we both accept and understand that we're not going to do it all ourselves. We're going to do it, we'll do a bit, they'll do a bigger bit, that's fine. That makes sense, that's broadly accepted, but they will accept that they can't do it all themselves either. And if that's where you start from, that's when you get a much more rational public policy debate. I think the point you were making about, you know, the sort of knee-jerk opposition is to say we must phase out nuclear as a populist rallying call only works when the public discourse isn't rooted in reality. And so you've got to get back to, don't try and address it by responding to what politicians are saying at a time. Address it by assessing why the politicians are saying that. That's the best way of tackling it.
Okay, good point. I buy that 100%. Okay. Any other suggestions or comments, questions, issues to be raised?
예. 제가 듣기로는 그 행크루 포인트 사업은 저 민자 발전 방식, 인디펜던트 파워 프로바이더 방식인데 지금 사이즈LC는 퍼블릭 파트너십으로 하고 있는 걸로 알고 있거든요. 약 영국 정부가 20% 정도 재원을 투자하고 있는 걸로 알고 있는데, 사실 그 저희가 영국 사업을 다시 옛날에도 그렇고 그냥 쉽지 않은 것이, 우리가 그 발전소를 지는데 저희 같은 경우 한전 돈으로 10조 넘는 돈을 이제 투자를 해야 되거든요. 그것을 향후 60년간 그 전기요금으로 뽑아내야 되는데, 사실 전력 시장도 사실 그 완전히 개방돼 있고 저희 같은 경우는 사실 리스크 측면에서 상당히 좀 어렵습니다. 그래서 사실 그 사이즈 제시 방식, 정부가 재원을 투자하는 방식 그렇게 해야 사실 저희도 한전이나 한국 그 관련 팀들도 같이 그것을 믿고 영국의 건설을 쉽게 투자할 수 있고 또 그렇게 함으로써 또 그 다른 우리 대주단 은행이라든가 거기에서 같이 대입을 이제 우리한테 빌려주는데 그거에 대해서 어떻게 좀 계속 후속기 프로젝트에서도 계속 그런 방식으로 영국 정부가 재원을 일부 투자하는 방식으로 할 계획인지 좀 그게 궁금합니다.
So in my presentation, and Tom alluded to it as well, I did talk to the fact that the National Infrastructure Committee did say that these projects, these new nuclear projects, were enormously expensive and would require more private and public funding in the model going forward. So that was one of its statements. Its second statement was it recommended that that could only be done under a regulated asset-based model, which is what we're seeing under Sizewell C. So I think that the advice that was given at that point has been taken on board in terms of how you move Sizewell C forward. I can't go into the specifics of the Sizewell C deal, but Sizewell C is going to be a degree of EDF money, UK government money, and potentially another private investor that they will look to see. That brings its own complexities, because in a replication model where you're using your technology and wanting to bring your entire supply chain across under your commercial terms, that does present some degree of risk for private investors. So I think there's things to work through there. But I think the policy as it's laid out in the National Infrastructure Committee report, I think that the opening of the UK's infrastructure bank, I think that the policy that was lost in the mini budget that was overtaken by many other catastrophic events where it said UK needed to be open for much more private investment from other sources. I think a lot of needles point in the direction of the sector is only going to be successful if private money can come supported by public money.
I mean, it's a fact that you know better than everybody else that the funding, the financing approach to nuclear projects in the UK, when KEPCO was preferred bidder for NuGen, if you think back to that time, at that point, people knew, industry certainly knew, and were telling government and various others, including our National Audit Office, that the CFD model as being used at Hinkley just wouldn't work for any future projects. It has taken our government some time to catch up with that, but they have now done with that RAB model that has now been legislated for, so that exists. I think it's highly likely that every and any future nuclear project will either be financed through the RAB mechanism. The only alternative I see is potentially at some point in the future there might be a decision to do something purely through state funding. But at the moment, I don't see that that's likely. I think the most likely thing is that RAB will endure. So RAB is not just for Sizewell C. RAB will first be applied with Sizewell C, but I think it will be for every nuclear project that comes after that. And the point to remember about this in relation to the UK's energy security strategy is we're talking up to 24 gigawatts by 2050. We're talking 25% of the power mix. We're talking large and small scale. We're therefore talking about there being other technologies than the EPR in terms of large scale. So the environment has changed. The challenge is the same as it was when you were preferred bidder for NuGen. But you know, the environment has changed, I think, quite significantly to make it something which there's much more opportunity because those fundamentals have changed. And you know, the proportion of investment that will come from the state as opposed to privately raised finance under a RAB model, I think that will differ from project to project, frankly. It will depend on the maturity of the technology, where you can point to previous developments in that technology and how effective they've been. All the points you were making actually would weigh into a position where you might find that it's easier rather than harder to attract some of that private capital for two reasons. One is because the mechanism is right for it, because the structure of the returns makes sense. And secondly, because the technology is not a first of a kind. And both of those factors, I think, mean that there might be less requirement for there to be a significant amount of state funding for projects as you go forward. And it all comes back to the same thing, which is about we need to have a program. We need to provide clarity to the industry and supply chain. What are we going to do over what time period? And that makes it a much, much more beneficial market for KEPCO and for others to potentially play in, compared to the time in which you were trying to, and for very, very understandable and frankly predictable reasons, ended up concluding that it wasn't going to be possible at that time. I think we should learn from that and have a much better go next time.
You're happy with Mark and Tom's answers? Happy. Happy ending. Okay. Next. Oh, before we move on to next one, it just pops up right now, which is that since we're talking about not just large power plants, but also small, medium, and possibly microreactors and renewables, that may necessitate the restructuring of electric grid system. For example, currently centralized, most likely, but it's going to be more and more distributed in the future, and not too distant future. So did you have any idea about this? Or, because I didn't necessarily hear anything about this electric grid system as far as your presentations are concerned.
So it's not particularly an area of expertise that, that I would say, but, we do know, for example, that the new gen scheme in Cumbria was fraught with difficulty around its connectivity to the grid, so it is a challenge. But the point I will make, and this is just through awareness through other regions, the whole policy on microgrid and how that becomes a reality, I think, is a global phenomenon. I don't think we've yet not seen an environment where people have made that work. So the power is much more freely distributed. I think it's still quite a controlled environment, set by few and delivered by even fewer.
Okay, that's good enough. I went a little too far.
Well, I touched on, in my presentation, I just touched on, and time constraints and everything else, so I didn't get into it in a huge amount of detail, but the challenge in managing the grid, where you've got a significant amount of variable output sources, is much more complex than it ever used to be. But by the same token, there are more tools to be able to address that. There's a lot of things you can do through digitization, blockchain, lots of things you can do. And our national grid in the UK is grappling with those, but its problem is grappling with those in the same time as we've got an existing system which is under huge strain. And there's a very real challenge in there. But I think fundamentally, we're always going to need, even with greater micro grid or regional grids, we're still going to need, certainly in the UK context and an island, a national grid. We're still going to need to be able to move dispatchable power produced in high volume, high concentration from around the country to counteract some of the other inefficiencies that come from microgrid. So we shouldn't see it as a zero-sum game. Actually, there is always going to be, I don't see any circumstances where you're not going to need a centralized grid function. And actually, when you think back to it, why did we develop a national grid in the first place? It was precisely for that reason, to make sure we could ensure that there was reliability of power to everybody wherever they were. And without it, we would either have to sacrifice that, and as much as we can get benefits from different technologies, microgeneration, all those things are all part of the solution. But we shouldn't use that as a reason to justify junking something which has been fundamental and will continue to be fundamental to reliability of supply to everybody.
I just thought that you have already gone through this because you got large capacity relating to offshore as well as onshore wind power plus solar. So you must have done some thought on this distribution system. That's why I was coming from. Okay. Any other questions? And move on to next one.
그 두 가지 분야에서 좀 질문드리겠는데요. 하나는 그 대형 원전하고 지금 향후에 대한 SMR 그에 대해서 향후에 대해 배치 계획이나 플랜이 구체적으로 돼 있는지. 그다음에 두 번째는 SMR 같은 경우는 지금 영국은 롤스로이스사가 주도하고 있는데 다른 그 개발사나 해외 개발사들에 대해서 어떻게 같이 병행해서 아니면 다른 것들도 향후 적용할 가능성이 있는지 그거에 대해서 궁금합니다.
Okay, so in terms of the first question about deployment, a lot of this will come down to what Great British Nuclear is being established to do, which is the delivery body I talked about, because we know what the high-level objective is, up to 24 gigawatts by 2050, or roughly 25%. We know that that's going to need large-scale as well as SMR to be able to get that, because of the nature of the sites that are available currently that have been identified and the likely, certainly first sites for potential SMR development. So that's the first thing. So does that very obviously leaves open the question that for both large and small, could there be others than EPR for large and Rolls-Royce-led consortium for SMR? And I think the answer to that is almost certainly yes. But the detail on that you asked for, I can't give you, because GBN, as it gets established, will do that as its early, my understanding, it will be its early work will be effectively clarity about what, where and when. And that will come, I hope, pretty soon. In terms of involvement in Rolls-Royce SMR, the consortium, as it is a UK consortium, and it's but it's not got the full supply chain necessarily. But you've got to remember, it's factory built is the proposition. So factory built, taken to site, bolted together. So it's about the content of some of those modules, and that there could be opportunities there. Will there be more than one SMR technology potentially deployed? I suspect that if GBN undertakes a technology assessment for SMR, it will look to have more than one option. I couldn't say who, I couldn't say how many exactly, but I suspect there'll be more than one option. So there will be things to potentially play for in that. It's not a closed shop.
I didn't really have much more to add than when you were asking about, could you get involved in investment? The UK government has backed SMRs to a large tune at the minute to supporting the GDA process. If I was looking backwards to look forwards in terms of time and cost to get our nuclear projects through GDA and investable to a point where they are moving, is that project going to need more investment? Absolutely. Will it come from, UK nuclear? Potentially, who knows? I don't think we understand certainly enough about the SMR market at the minute to understand where else that funding may come from. I do think, and Tom and I were reflecting on this over coffee, I think the whole programme needs to unlock itself somehow, because if you imagine these things are going to be built in a factory, modular, what you need is you need an order book of these SMRs to be able to build the factory to build them. The order book won't come unless somebody sees one's been built and it's proven and it's gone through GDA. So I do think there needs to be a way of unlocking the cycle that it might find itself in. Whether again UK nuclear does that by saying, right, what we'll do as UK government is we'll invest in 3 of these things to allow you to build the factory. That may unlock the process, but I think that project's got a long way to run in terms of its complexity and how it gets moving properly.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Rolls-Royce SMR was supposed to produce 450 megawatts of electricity, which sounded to me like a little bit big for a small modular reactor. It's like a medium modular reactor, something anyway. I'm just teasing you, but was there like a magic number that you just came up with?
The reason it got to that, because if you were studying this and look back at initially when Rolls-Royce were first talking about effectively adapting a technology they already exists in terms of submarine reactor to make it a small reactor power plant. I think initially they were talking about 250 and something like that, and it's gradually got up to about 400 and whatever it is, 460, 450, whatever that figure is. And you're quite right, that isn't that small. Compared to some of our previous power stations that have now gone, they were similar size. Quite a lot of the Magnox ones, weren't they? They were slightly bigger, but around about that size. It's the M for modular, which is much more significant though, because the M for modular is the bit that the proposition enables factory built. So therefore, you're not as much a prisoner of characteristics of particular sites in quite the same way. As nobody builds a factory to build one car, do they? So as you build, the economies of volume as opposed to economies of scale have an impact. But as we discussed, as Mark said, that's why you need enough of an order book to justify building the factory, and that's where there needs to be a break in that impasse, I think, relatively soon. And the most rational thing for that would be for there to be, I think, an order from the UK government that unlocks that to enable it to happen. But yeah, it's the modular bit which is much more significant, I think, than whether it's 250, 300, 450 megawatts capacity.
And this may be to pay you some compliments there over us. And I think the other thing about building a factory like this to build a product like this is it's probably not something we've ever done before on the scale that it would be needed. Whereas if I look at the work I've done in the oil and gas sector with your big companies like Samsung and Hyundai, where you're processizing and factoryizing those kind of fabrication of big products that go to sites and get bolted together. There's definitely something that you've got there in your engineering prowess and your proven technology in your big yards that we don't currently possess in the UK. Not in nuclear, absolutely.
We do. Sorry, I'm just going to say we do to some extent in shipbuilding, but in shipbuilding we've done that at least partly from learning from Korea. Actually, if you want an example of where something's moved to be much more modular and to very precision engineering, we now do. There's a thing. What was the David Attenborough? That was a Arctic exploration vessel that's being built, has been built, and I remember going to the shipyard where it was being built and the modules and seeing the modules, and it's millimeter precision, but a lot of that capability and technology has been taken from and developed from something I know from what they were saying that you've done here first. So there you go. There's a parallel that we can maybe draw from.
Anything else, or do we need to?
한 가지 더 물어보겠습니다. GDA 관련인데요. 좀 전에 SMR 얘기도 나왔지만은 우리 대형 원전 같은 경우는 GDA를 취득하는데 약 5년 정도 소요되는 걸로 알고 있고요. 그리고 그렇다면 SMR은 계략적으로 몇 년이나 되는 건지, 왜 그러냐면 대형 원전 한 기, 두 기를 만약에 수출한다, 또 SMR도 뭐 1기가와트 만약에 한다. 1기가와트면 우리 ISMR로는 상당히 좀 많은 건데, 그걸 하면서 실제로 초기 투자비가 상당히 많이 들어가거든요. 또 기간도 대형 원전 5년인데 롤스로이스 것은 GDA를 취득하는데 몇 년 정도 걸렸는지 그것도 궁금하고, 또 하나 아까 제가 파워포인트에 마크 세비지의 파워포인트에 힌크리 포인트에 GDA가 2017년도 1월에 시작해서 2022년도 2월에 디시전 됐다고 돼 있는데요. 보통 우리가 취득하는데 5년 걸리는데 이것은 리뉴얼 하는데 5년 걸린 건지 그게 좀 궁금합니다. 아니면 보통 리뉴얼 할 때는 짧게 끝나는 걸로 알고 있는데 실제로 리뉴얼 할 때도 그만큼 취득하는 만큼 기간이 걸리는 건지.
All right. So on the first question, Rolls-Royce GDA, the short answer is I don't know how long it will take because they've started that process. But it's been the ONR, so the regulator that oversees the generic design assessment, has been able to condense it slightly. So it may well be that it's maybe sort of, I'm hazarding a guess a little bit, but maybe like 4 years rather than 5. Maybe I think the target is 40-something months, isn't it? Which is just under 4 years. So they have tried to condense, and that's the regulator, learning and developing and evolving and trying to, as they can without compromising the integrity of the regulation process, address some of the concerns about GDA. I think there's a wider issue though about anything else going into GDA, which obviously you only have to do once, but is about the capacity for the ONR to be able to oversee a number of GDA processes all at the same time, potentially. They won't have the capacity to do that, frankly. That's why, coming back to GBN, the programmatic approach is so important, so that can be properly factored in. In terms of the renewal of the GDA, I don't think it went, Hinkley, the EPR went through GDA and took 5 years. You don't have to do it again, so it's done it now. So for building Sizewell, it doesn't have to do that because you've done it at Hinkley. So doesn't need to be a refresh if it's the same technology. That's the whole point of it. It's supposed to be generic design assessment, and it was right from the start. The idea was if you're going to build a number of reactors of the same design, you go through the GDA process once. That gives you your effective, your license for that reactor to then be developed. You have to get local permission at the site, but that's site-specific things only. So that's the advantage that that there is with Sizewell C, in that you won't have the same lead-in time as for Hinkley, partly because you don't have to do the GDA, you don't have to qualify all of the same stuff again. You don't have to mobilise the supply chain again, and that's another replication benefit in terms of time as well as money.
And to bring that to life, so if you look at Sizewell, like Tom said, the GDA is for the technology and the reactor, and that carries. What's changed at Sizewell is the planning conditions, because we're putting a reactor in a different part of the UK, therefore some of the build conditions, not of the reactor and the machine, but the associated balance of plant change, so we have to put different seawalls in place because of the coastal erosion in East Anglia. We have to put the reactor at a different elevation to account for future. So the actual technological design and build doesn't change. It's just some of the conditions by which it's built alter, but the core technology stays exactly as it is. So in theory, you could take a reactor through GDA once, and it's back to Tom's point earlier. If you took a view of building a fleet, so Tom was talking about, understandably, why you pull out a new gem when you get 3 years into the GDA process and then we're just sinking money, no commitment, blah, blah, et cetera, et cetera. If you could see a fleet, the investment in a GDA starts to have some credence, because you can see a fleet of these things coming that are going to return that investment.
Is it okay? I was told that also Ministry of Industry had a lot of questions to be asked here. Was it all set as far as this discussion was concerned, or is there anything else?
사실 저는 업계 쪽 얘기를 많이 좀 드리러 온 것도 있는데요. 그럼 저는 좀 큰 틀에서 하나 좀 궁금한 게, 저희 지난 5년간 탈원전 정책으로 원전 업계가 좀 어려움을 겪었는데요. 이렇게 원전 정책은 국가 정책에 큰 영향을 미칠 수밖에 없는 그런 산업이라고 생각을 합니다. 근데 이번 현 정부 들어서는 저희 윤석열 대통령께서 나토에 가셔가지고 많은 정상들에게 원전을 직접 세일즈를 하고, 또 원전 정책이 국정과제의 3번으로 오를 만큼 굉장히 중요한 정책으로 부각되면서 다시 업계가 좀 살아나고 많이 기대도 하고 있는 상황인데요. 영국 같은 경우에는 최근에 이제 총리님이 2번이나 바뀌었고, 특히 최근에 수낙 총리님이 이제 당선이 돼가지고 국정 운영할 텐데, 기본적으로 원전에 대해서는 탄소 중립과 에너지 안보를 위해 필요하다라고 그렇게 말씀하신 건 알고 있습니다. 근데 일각에서는 또 우려도 있는 것 같은데 원전 정책의 영국의 원전 정책의 그 방향에 대해서 좀 설명해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Yeah, we had 3 prime ministers in 6 weeks, I think, which is quite remarkable. Never been happen quite like that before, and I hope it won't ever happen like that again. But the point I made before is that actually the current prime minister, the latest prime minister, has been asked about nuclear a number of times in prime minister's questions and in Parliament since he's been in post, and has said every single time that we need to do more nuclear. In the election within the Conservative Party to become the leader of the party and therefore Prime Minister, he committed himself to getting to what was in the energy security strategy, so the up to 24 gigawatts by 2050. So the people might have changed, but that policy is absolutely consistent and run through those people. And it's not just in that party, it's also in the main opposition party. So and last week when we had the autumn statements of the budget event, the new Chancellor made very clear the commitment to nuclear and specifically on Sizewell C. So, I think the reason why there is that level of consistency is because it doesn't matter who you are. When you get into that position, the scale of the challenge means the answer is pretty clear and obvious, and there hasn't been anybody who's come up with a different answer. So I would be comforted by that even amidst political turbulence and change of personality, the policy actually has been consistent during that period, and I expect it to be consistent going forwards.
Any other questions? Happy? Done? How about from Hyundai or Dusan? Looks like you guys are really done. Okay, then it's just I'm just trying to tease you guys a little bit because coming back to Rolls-Royce, because they must have a good experience in making very small reactors for nuclear submarines. So I was rather surprised that they have come up with this huge reactor according to their scale. So I was just wondering if there was any push from the political side or within their organization, why still they came up with this big, small modular reactor.
I guess teasing you back, you know, we don't know about all it is. If you're going to go large, you know, it's you couldn't just take a nuclear reactor out of a sub and plonk it next to a city. You're still going to have to go through a GDA process, and you know, you're going to have to look at how many of those you're going to have to build on a national basis. So, you know, I'm not sure you know why they've taken that decision, but it's, you know, from my perspective, it's, you know, they've chosen the technology, they've chosen how they're going to do it, they've chosen the size, they're going through the GDA process now. So, you know, as somebody who's passionate about nuclear in the UK, you know, what I want to see is the industry get behind it. You know, that's basically what I just want to see the industry get behind it. I want to see the UK government get behind it. And I want to see the important thing about nuclear in the UK is I want to see the communities that thrive off nuclear as a service line and thrive off nuclear as an industry. I want to see them kind of be supported, because, you know, the one thing we haven't touched on in either of our presentations today is the UK has some very rural communities that rely on the nuclear industry for its whole economy. And I think that's why a lot of this nuclear policy is so vitally important. You know, when you see public opinion, if you go to these rural communities, they're absolutely 100% pro-nuclear. We've got the skills, we've got the capability, we've got the site license, we want to go. You know, so that's what I personally just want to see, the government, the industry, foreign investors, whoever, you know, I want to see that us get behind it, you know, and it will be a success.
I mean, I can't answer why did Rolls-Royce get to 450 as opposed to another number. But my assumption is that comes from an assessment of a number of different factors, including where the market looks like what it wants, including not just in the UK but more widely. They've chosen not to go for a micro-reactor technology which would be suitable for very remote and rural areas like bits of Canada, for example, where there's a relatively small population but there's little choice but burning diesel mostly for power, as an example. But there are other technologies that might be more applicable to that. Certainly in the case of the UK, in terms of licensed nuclear sites that are not suitable for large-scale reactors, there are a number which, although the site assessment process hasn't been done, when you look at the size of them, what they had before, that type of size of SMR would be perfectly applicable to those sites, and I suspect that may well also have had something to do with the ultimate sort of size that they've decided to push for. But it's an adaptation of a technology. It's not just taking it out and plonking it down. So there's a lot of factors, balance of plant, other things that come in to take account of how you get that sweet spot between economies of scale and economies of volume by doing something in a factory built. And I think that's probably where they got to. But I don't know the detail of why they got to that size.
Okay, you guys are finally off the hook by now as far as SMR is concerned. And finally, question from the floor, and that's relating to NDA, National Decommissioning Authority, as I recall it, right? So can you say a few words about this particular organization? Because we are in the position to think about decommissioning the very first two units. One is pressure water reactor, the other pressure heavy water reactor. So we're on deck by now.
So I guess to share a bit of history, I worked on the transition of the NDA, and originally, how if I talk with how it came to be and now what it does, and that'll kind of tell you the story and maybe some of the lessons along the way. So many years ago, the nuclear industry in the UK was called BNFL, British Nuclear Fuels Limited, and the government basically owned, maintained, and ran all the assets. So heavy public liability with very little accountability, it would have been said. So what happened was they went through a transition where they looked at the American model where you have owner, operator of a site, maintainer, operator of a site. So basically you employ somebody under a contract to operate that facility for you under a set of performance objectives, and you drive a much more commercial arrangement around how those sites are driven and incentivized and how performance is managed. So at the time what they did, because when you move to that kind of model of maintenance operator from owner operator, you then have to have a body which kind of owns the liability and the license and et cetera, to keep that continuity. And the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority was therefore formed to oversee that competition process of bringing in the maintainer operator and then performance managing them against a set of criteria. I think, and Tom maybe correct me, I think 4 or 5 years ago, it was found that model hadn't worked. And in fact, in some instances, it had been found to be a bit of a catastrophe. Large American companies come in to run our sites, and not because the large American companies are bad companies, by the way, but the whole operating model around a UK nuclear licensed site being operated by a contractor under a commercial agreement just didn't work the same.
American companies, Energy Solutions.
So Energy Solutions run Magnox, and for Sellafield it was URS or Washington Group. They're now AECOM, and I think AECOM have just divested them again. So they were the companies that came in. So the transition of the maintenance operator moved back to the UK government, and the NDA's role is really about assurance. So the government needs some sort of buffer in between BEIS, which is dealing with future policy, which is dealing with environmental policy, and which is now dealing with the decommissioning policy. So the NDA, if you like, operates as that buffer that demonstrates, is the taxpayer getting value for money? Are the sites delivering what they should be delivering? Are the strategies robust? So it's not a management company that it delivers. It's more a thin assurance layer that assures the government that things are being done the way they should be doing, which means BEIS don't have to carry that capability. I think that's the simplest way I can describe it.
Okay, looks like he's gone a little bit further than that because he said NDA was supposed to be responsible only technically, not just monetarily. For example, funding is being done by somebody else?
No. So NDA will assure the funding. So Sellafield will make an application each year for a fiscal fund that the government, and the NDA will assure that and ensure that the government are giving them against the agreed strategy, against the agreed outcomes. So Sellafield will determine the technical solution it requires to decommission its portfolio. The NDA will assure that's the right solution that drives value for money. So it stops Sellafield aiming for moonshots and keeps Sellafield aiming for realistic targets that are deliverable and achievable.
Can you also give us a ballpark figure as far as a comparison between gas-cooled versus water-cooled reactors are concerned with the same comparable size? Just ballpark figures. Envelope, back of envelope calculation.
Figures for what?
Decommissioning. Cost, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's so difficult to give you a ballpark figure on decommissioning costs because if you looked at Chapelcross at Sellafield, Magnox at Sellafield, which was Chapelcross, its decommissioning was relatively simple as decommissioning goes, to get it to a point now where it's in safe storage. If you look at exactly the same technology up at Capenhurst, not Capenhurst, what's the one over the border in Scotland? Chapelcross, yeah. Calder Hall at Sellafield, Chapelcross just over the border. Even though that's a repeatable technology, its decommissioning costs are much higher because it employed different solutions in the pond cooling around some of the catalysts it used. So it's very difficult to give kind of a ballpark figure for what does it cost to decommission a reactor because you know that they're all, like Tom said earlier, I don't think we ever built two exactly the same. So they've all got nuances in amongst them that prevent it being kind of the ballpark figure would be 600 million to 2 billion. You know, it's so difficult to.
Okay, stupid question, smart answer. Any other questions from the floor? From the panelists? There's one, I think. Maybe.
이런 자리를 마련해 주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 오늘 토론을 통해서 너무나 기쁜 소식을 전달해 주신 모든 분께 감사를 드립니다. 특히 저는 APR 1400 개발부터 국내 사업에 좀 관련 경험이 있는 한수원 출신인데요. 우리 김동환 팀장님께 제안이라 그럴까 건의라 그럴까 질문이니까 한번 하고 싶은데요. 오늘 이런 환경이 돌아오기까지 우리가 너무나 수십 년 동안 다 고생한 끝에 와가지고 한국과 영국과 이렇게 협력할 수 있는 기회가 온 것에 대해서 절호의 기회가 왔을 때 오늘 또 데이터가 24기가와트라는 큰 목표를 갖고 하는 영국과 협력하는데 공은 이제는 이 원자력 사업 자체는 가버먼트 투 가버먼트 사업이에요. 그래서 이제 공이 산자부에 넘어갔으니 굳이 제가 말을 안 해서 잘 하시겠지만도 높아심에서 언젠가는 뉴스에서 우리 대통령과 아까 탐이 이야기했던 그 영국 총리 간에 어떤 계약이라든지 MOU라든지 이런 선언식이라든지 이 탑다운으로 해야 되지 바텀으로 가게 되면 일이 굉장히 꼬여요. 그래서 그런 길에 오기를 기다리고 있는데 어떻게 해줄 수 있겠죠?
예, 원전 수출과 관련된 그 사업은 국가 대 국가 대항전으로 저도 생각을 하고 있고요. 그래서 팀 코리아라는 것이 결성이 되어서 원팀으로 움직이고 있습니다. 저도 그 플로어에서 주신 그런 기대가 곧 현실화되기를 바라고 있고요. 그래서 저희가 다 노력을 하고 있는 건 사실입니다. 예.
Please.
오늘 토론에 감사의 말씀은 이제 생략하고요. 질문만 말씀드리면 지금 원전 건설 그리고 디커미셔닝 해체하고 하는 거에 대해서 말씀 많이 하셨는데 그 중요하죠. 그런데 한국에서도 문제가 계속 이제 그 레이즈가 되고 하는 그 부분이 이게 방사능 폐기물을 어떻게 처리하느냐 하는 부분이 굉장히 문제가 좀 어려움이 있고 되는 것 같은데 영국에서는 그 방사능 폐기물을 어떻게 처리하시는지 그리고 그게 만약 문제 없이 처리가 되는 어떤 그 기술이라든가 정책이 있으면 한국에도 그거를 적용을 하면 좋지 않을까 하는 그런 이제 생각이 있어서 그런 분야에 대해서 협력을 한번 여쭤보고요. 또 하나는 터너 앤 타운센드가 지금 이제 영국의 그 원자력 건설하고 디커미셔닝 하는 쪽에 경험을 갖고 계신데 영국 외에 다른 국가에 이런 경험을 하신 거는 있는지 그리고 또 서플라이 체인이 굉장히 그 원전 건설에서는 중요할 텐데 지금까지는 제가 알고 있기로는 프랑스 업체라든가 중국 업체가 건설을 많이 맡아서 한 것 같은데요. 그때의 그 서플라이 체인하고 앞으로 계획하고 있는 영국의 이제 원자력 발전소 건설에 한국 기업이 참여했을 때에 그 지금 그 셋업이 돼 있다면 그런 그 서플라이 체인을 우리가 또 활용할 수 있는 그런 방법이 있는지 뭐 그런 거에 대해서 좀 질문을 드리겠습니다.
Nuclear Achilles heel.
So dealing with these in bits. So waste storage, and you know, I grew up as an engineer on Sellafields. So Sellafields' primary purpose is to safely remediate and store the nuclear legacy. And you know, if I break that into two pieces, one is about policy, and then I'll come back to Sellafields. So at the minute, the UK hasn't fixed on its policy for the geological disposal facility. So it's been talked about for quite a long time. The location has been selected and deselected and reselected, but I think everyone knows where the location is, but we still await a policy decision on the geological disposal facility. In the interim, Sellafields' position is to safely store the UK's nuclear legacy. So it has a mixture of low-level waste, which we call the low-level waste repository, isn't actually Sellafield, it's a separate limited company just down the railway line. But the intermediate level waste is all stored in, and when I talked about Sellafield's future portfolio and the programme of work that it's committing to its supply chain is all about waste storage. So its site is basically filling up with more and more waste stores. That's the constraint Sellafield is working within. So intermediate level waste stores are being built where waste is encapsulated, often encapsulated in stainless steel drums, injected with concrete, and then sent along storage. High level waste is obviously also stored at Sellafield, and I'm sure you're familiar with the term vitrification, where the high level waste is turned into solid glass, and then that's stored underground. The UK is at the minute, I know Sellafield is looking at opportunities to export some of that waste back to its parent companies, but that's a longer target, and in the interim Sellafield will continue to store it. Then obviously Sellafield also safely stores the plutonium from the original civil nuclear. So the whole purpose of Sellafield is to remediate its legacy and also safely store the current UK stockpile of nuclear waste. In terms of Turner and Townsend overseas and nuclear, what we are as a company is we're very strict in terms of where we operate around capabilities we have. So, you know, we've always stuck with the UK in nuclear at the minute because we're a strong operation in the UK. We understand the UK's ecosystem around delivery, and we understand where we kind of fit within that. We are working with a client in the Middle East at the minute, ENEC. We're doing some work with them on a commercial piece of work, but that's very specific. We had opportunities to work with Rosatom in Russia which we had declined many years ago for reasons before where we were, now again linked to capability and our association. So it is something we are keen to explore. You know, I was talking with your guys this morning about Poland, for example. You know, as our business matures and as it grows its presence in more locations, we are looking at sectors that we can then enter in, bringing that bit like what you're talking about, which is you have a core capability here that you can export to there in a controlled manner. We absolutely follow the same strategy. You know, we wouldn't look to stretch ourselves into regions where we didn't have the capability to deliver the service. And I think, Tom, you were going to cover the supply chain piece.
Yeah, so on the point you're making about reactors being built, so the EPR is obviously a technology design that's owned by EDF, so it's an EDF design, although it sort of comes from various different places, but give it that headline. We aren't building a Chinese technology. There isn't a Chinese technology being built in the UK. There was at one point a process towards doing that, but that isn't happening. With the supply chain for that, for Hinkley, and therefore for Sizewell, that is by value 60-something, about roughly 65%. About 2/3 of that is UK or UK joint venture companies. So a lot of that value comes into the UK, despite the fact the technology isn't UK owned in that sense. So read that across to, if we do other large-scale reactors, if that could be potentially AP1400, for example, then there would be opportunities there, but there would still be there will still be an expectation. I think that proportion by value will come from the UK supply chain, and that's where you can get smart about collaboration, isn't it? When you've got a technology derived from somewhere, and part of it you can do in that market, you can then build collaboration with that bit of the supply chain to take into third markets, and vice versa. And that's really the essence of what we're talking about here. So I wouldn't see it at all as being impossible to be able to get into that supply chain at all.
And just to add to that and kind of bring some colour to that example, on a large railway scheme in the UK, there's a pretty big rolling stock contract to go out. And, if we look around the world at people who produce high-speed rolling stock, there aren't many of them. But for the successful bidder, the question back to them was, what are you doing to invest back in the UK? So it wasn't that you don't get the contract, but the question was, are you willing to invest in a factory in the UK that would produce this and also provide you greater pipeline of work in the UK and potentially Europe? So I think there's some of the questions. If you're looking to enter the UK market, we put stats up today that were showing, 25,000 people employed, 60% of the UK supply chain, small, medium enterprise engagement. So I think UK PLC just looks at this and goes, how do we build a UK capability? Doesn't mean exclusive. I think the UK construction industry is more collaborative now than I think it's ever been. Clients understand that you can't discharge risk. Clients understand that they can't commercially hold organisations over a barrel. So it is super collaborative and is really keen on broader collaboration to get a solution.
Okay, Mr. Kwon is over here just to finish this up. Okay, back there. 저기 뒤에 계시네요.
예, 고맙습니다. 저는 질문보다 레코멘데이션 좀 드리려고 그러는데요. 영국하고 한국하고 이 협력을 하는 방안이 양국 간의 협력인지 아니 제3국 진출을 위한 협력인지 그걸 분명히 하셔야 될 것 같습니다. 왜냐하면 영국은 아마 원자로 타입이 5가지 종류 넘는 것 같은데 한국은 지금 PWR이라는 걸 표준 원전으로 가고 있거든요. 그 다음에 영국은 메이커 중심으로 가는 것 같은데 한국은 발전 회사하고 AE 중심으로 돼 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 제가 제안 드리는 것은 상당한 차이가 있기 때문에 제3국이든 양국이 협력을 하든 팀 빌딩을 역할 분담을 어떻게 할 건지 거기에부터 출발을 해야 되지 않을까. 이 준비 없이 그냥 들어갈 수는 없을 것 같다는 생각입니다. 그래서 이 정부 쪽에서도 나오셨으니까 그걸 양국 정부 간에 이 협력 모델을 어떻게 할 건지 그거 아마 시간이 꽤 많이 소요될 걸로 알고 있습니다. 그걸 좀 서둘렀으면 하고 레코멘데이션 드립니다. 감사합니다.
Who's going to volunteer to deal with this tough question, which might sounds to me like it's beyond our scope of discussion, but you may give it a try.
이거 뭐 특별하게 제가 코멘트할 수 있는 부분은 아닌 것 같고요. 저희는 많은 가능성에 대해서 염두에 두고 수출의 형태를 고민하고 있거든요. 영국과는 어떤 방법이 최선일지에 대해서 좀 주신 조언 소중하게 잘 검토를 해보겠습니다. 참고로 현 정부 들어서 원전 수출이라는 것을 뭐 노용 수출이라든가 기자재 수출이라든가 서비스 수출이라든가 이런 식으로 좀 구분해서 또 운영을 하고 있고 양국 간의 협력, 그다음에 공동 지출 이런 거 모든 걸 다 고려하고 있다는 점도 추가적으로 설명드립니다.
혹시 이 교수님 답을 좀 주실 수 있을 것 같은데, as an organizer, you may be able to give us some right answer to his question. As far as what kind of collaboration are we talking about? To start with.
지금
네, 장시간 발표해 주시고 또 토론해 주셔서 감사드립니다. 제가 개회사에서 말씀드린 것처럼 이번 토론이 이번 국제 세미나가 한 번에 이렇게 딱 끝나는 것이 아니라 이게 계기가 돼서 앞으로 지속적인 협력 방안을 또 이렇게 이런 세미나를 통해서 해나갔으면 좋겠습니다. 조금 전에 플로어에서 이렇게 이원환 교수께서 질문해 주신 영국과 한국의 협력 모델 이런 것들도 어떤 과제로 우리가 수행할 수 있지 않을까라는 생각도 되고요. 우리 건설산업비전포럼에는 많은 전문가들이 있기 때문에 우리 산업자원부에서 그런 과제를 위탁한다 그러면 협력 모델에 좀 어떻게 보면은 프레임 같은 것도 우리가 좀 만들어 드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그리고 오늘 이렇게 토론이 이제 시간이 제약 때문에 이제 마무리해야 되기 때문에 토론하지 못했던 이런 것들을 저희 포럼으로 뭐 질의사항이나 이런 것들을 전해주시면 다시 오늘 저 발표자들에게 전달해드리고 앞으로 이런 협력이 잘 이루어지면 우리 기업들과 또 정부에서 팀이 돼서 영국을 방문하셔서 실제 현황을 좀 보시고 또 그런 걸 통해서 우리가 어떻게 영국과 협력을 해야 할 것인가도 얘기를 나누면 좋겠고 영국의 원전 건설 또 한국의 원전 건설을 서로 협력하는 것도 중요한데 다 팀이 영국과 한국이 하나의 팀이 돼서 또 제3국에 또 진출하는 그 방안도 시너지 효과를 낼 수 있지 않을까 하는 생각이 듭니다. 네, 오늘 주제토론 감사하게 들었습니다. 감사합니다.
Any other question? 다른 질문 혹시 있으신지요? Looks like we got 3 more minutes to go. 계신가요? Okay, maybe not. Then
네, 저는 인사이트 엠파워의 김소연 기자입니다. 오늘 발표 세미나 잘 들었고요. 제가 질문 드리고 싶은 건 2가지인데요. 영국의 핵융합 에너지 개발 현황에 대해서 첫 번째 질문을 드리고요. 또 두 번째는 셀라필드 단지가 이제 해체가 시작되면 그 안에서 사실 인력이 한 그러니까 11,000명 정도의 인력이 있었는데 단지가 해체되면 그 인력들에 대한 어떤 실업이 늘어날 텐데 또 그분들의 또 있었던 지역의 경제 활성화 이런 부분들에 대한 어떤 정부의 대책이나 NDA의 계획들이 있는지 그거에 대해서 2가지 질문에 답변을 해주시길 부탁드리겠습니다.
Mark, you've got 2 minutes to go.
So I'm going to cover Sellafield quite quickly because I think it echoes something I said earlier. So you're absolutely right that the decommissioning program is a program where you shut down and skills exit. But you know, when I come back to what I said earlier about these communities are desperate for nuclear, this is the reason why. You know, they've built their entire communities and they've built their entire families around the nuclear industry, as we did in the coal mining days in the UK, etc. So I think that's part of the journey at Sellafield. The other part of the journey at Sellafield is it has shifted strategy from direct recruitment to the long-term model of buying the supply chain to build capability and capacity, so it doesn't create that liability on itself. And the supply chain can offer much more opportunity than Sellafield can. That's the second thing it's doing. The third thing it's doing is it is investing a lot in upskilling people against the nuclear new build program. So, for example, we know that commissioning of new build reactors is really challenging. Sellafield as an operational environment has a lot of people who deeply understand the operational environment and how you commission a plant. So it is doing things as well to upskill people and migrate them across. But it's acknowledged, it's understood, and hence why new nuclear as a program is vital to those communities. And you know, hence why the new supply chain approaches are about how do you give people broader opportunity than just the local area that they may work in. And I think you're going to cover the fusion.
Just on fusion, it's just a bang on time, aren't we? So I'll be really quick. Fusion, there's a lot going on in the UK on fusion, but it's always been internationally collaborative. Both at Cullum in the UKAA recently announced siting for a spherical tokamak demonstration project on a site of an old coal-fired power station. So from fossil to fusion, energy renewal, but still energy. And there's a lot of exciting things happening on fusion, and in the fission side of nuclear, we should be as excited about that as we are about fission as well, because they're both really important, I think, long-term technologies for everywhere around the world to ensure that we have clean, reliable, secure power supplies.
Okay, perfect timing.
예, 감사합니다. 진심을 다한 토론에 감사드리고요. 특히 영국에서 오신 두 분은 어제 도착하셔가지고 시차도 극복을 아직 못하셨을 텐데 이렇게 장시간 성심성의껏 답변을 해주셨습니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 예, 근본 세미나를 통해서 한국과 영국의 원자력 분야가 서로 협력해서 상호 시장 진출은 물론 세계 시장으로 뻗어나갈 수 있는 계기가 되기를 바랍니다. 건설산업비전포럼은 산하경관의 오피니언 리더들이 모여서 건설 산업의 발전과 혁신을 추구하는 단체입니다. 포럼은 이러한 유의 토론의 세미나가 단발성에 그치지 않고 크나큰 결실을 맺을 때까지 지속적으로 노력할 것을 약속드립니다. 끝까지 자리를 같이 해주신 데 대해서 감사드리며 이것으로 토론의 모를 모두 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.